Welcome to another video on stories of our history. In the searing heat of June 1179, the green hills of the Upper Galilee echoed with the thunder of hooves and the catastrophic screams of shattered cavalry as the pride of the Knights Templar, led by their formidable Grand Master Odo de Saint-Amand, plunged headlong into one of the most ignominious disasters of the Crusader era at the Battle of Marj-Ayan. A battle that would forever change the perception of Templar invincibility, and set the stage for a personal drama of such stark, unyielding fanaticism that it continues to chill the blood of historians and enthusiasts more than 8 centuries later. What began as a calculated reconnaissance to probe Saladin's advancing forces, a routine military operation designed to assess the strength and disposition of the Ayyubid columns that had been ravaging the agricultural heartlands of the Galilee, rapidly devolved into a slaughter of catastrophic proportions. A moment where the unbridled aggression that had won the Templars immortal glory at Massacre just 2 years earlier transformed into the very instrument of their undoing, proving that the razor-thin line separating heroic audacity from suicidal recklessness could be crossed in the space of a single, ill-timed charge, with consequences that would reverberate through the political and military structures of the entire Latin kingdom. Odo de Saint-Amand, a man whose name was synonymous with the terrifying, white-mantled fanaticism of the Temple and whose reputation for unshakable courage had made him the most feared and respected warrior monk in Christendom, was not merely a commander on that field. He was the living, breathing embodiment of a doctrine that viewed retreat as damnation, negotiation as heresy, and death in combat as the highest form of prayer, a doctrine that he had enforced with an iron fist throughout his tenure as Grand Master, and that he was now, in the crucible of defeat, about to test against the ultimate limits of human endurance. When his charging knights were swallowed by the numerically superior forces of Saladin's brilliant nephew, Taqi al-Din, whose tactical genius for the feigned retreat had lured the heavy Christian cavalry into a perfectly laid trap, the Grand Master found himself unhorsed, isolated, and surrounded by a sea of scimitars and green banners, his magnificent destrier lying dead beneath him, his helmet torn from his head, and his body battered and bleeding from a dozen wounds. Yet even in that moment of utter catastrophe, the fire in his dark eyes remained unquenched, his spirit refusing to acknowledge the reality of his defeat as the rough hands of the Mamluk guards dragged him into a captivity that would test the very core of the Templar rule in ways that no battlefield trial, no matter how desperate, could ever have approached. The subsequent refusal of this proud, indomitable warrior to be ransomed, his chilling declaration that a Templar's only currency in captivity was his belt and his dagger, would not merely shock the medieval world, it would forge a legend of implacable, inhuman discipline that continues to define the dark mystique of the Order of the Temple to this very day, a legend that has inspired countless books, films, and documentaries, and that raises profound questions about the nature of honor, the limits of religious devotion, and the terrifying price that some men are willing to pay for the sake of an ideal that transcends the mortal world. The catastrophic engagement of Marj-Ayan was not a random skirmish but a direct consequence of the shifting strategic balance in the Levant, where the dying Leper King Baldwin IV, his body consumed by the relentless Mycobacterium leprae that had turned his flesh into a living tomb, was struggling with every remaining ounce of his formidable will to maintain the territorial integrity of the Kingdom of Jerusalem against the resurgent might of Saladin's newly unified Ayyubid Empire, an empire that now stretched from the Libyan desert to the mountains of Kurdistan, and that could summon armies of a size and sophistication that dwarfed anything the Franks could muster. The Templars, acting as the shock troops of the Crusader state and the self-appointed guardians of the Holy Sepulchre, were under immense, unrelenting pressure to deliver a decisive blow that would break the stranglehold of Saladin's patient, methodical strategy of attrition, a pressure that often overrode the cautious, pragmatic counsel of the secular barons who understood, with the hard-won wisdom of men who had spent their entire lives in the Holy Land, that Saladin's approach required a defensive, conservative response rather than the reckless offensive adventures that the Templars, with their institutional contempt for anything that smacked of the passive or the diplomatic, so fervently craved. Odo de Saint-Amand, however, was not a man of patience or of measured calculation. He was a hammer who saw every tactical problem as a nail, a battle-hardened veteran who had stood shoulder to shoulder with the Leper King in the miracle of Montgassard, who had seen the Mamluk guard break before the Templar wedge, and who believed, with the unshakable, burning conviction of a zealot whose faith had been forged in the white-hot crucible of holy war, that the massed charge of heavy cavalry, blessed by God and led by his anointed warriors, could break any enemy line, regardless of the numerical odds, regardless of the terrain, and regardless of the tactical situation. This conviction, admirable in its purity and terrifying in its intensity, was about to collide with the cold, hard, utterly unforgiving reality of Saladin's tactical genius on the banks of the Litani River, a collision that would tear the heart out of the Templar command structure, leave their Grand Master to rot in the sunless dungeons of Damascus, and set in motion a chain of events that would, within less than a decade, culminate in the total destruction of the Crusader army at the horns of Hattin and the fall of Jerusalem itself. This is the story of that catastrophic miscalculation, the iron code that prevented a rescue, the grim, solitary death that immortalized the man who chose the honor of the temple over his own life, and the dark, enduring legacy that his martyrdom cast across the final, tragic years of the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem, a legacy that continues to haunt the imagination of every student of the Crusades, every lover of tales of unyielding honor, and every human being who has ever wondered what it would cost to hold fast to a principle when the price of that fidelity is not merely the loss of liberty or the prospect of pain, but the slow, agonizing extinction of the self in the absolute darkness of a Saracen dungeon, with no witness but God, no comfort but prayer, and no ransom but the belt and the dagger that were the only possessions the Grand Master would deign to offer. We will journey deep into the black, rat-infested depths of the Damascus citadel, explore the secret theology of the Templar rule that transformed captivity into a divine test of purity, examine the political and military consequences of Odo's absence on the fragile coalition that held the Kingdom of Jerusalem together, and confront the uncomfortable, enduring question that his sacrifice raises. Was the Grand Master a saint of unbreakable integrity, a man consumed by his own pride, or something far more complex and far more human that defies our modern categories and demands a deeper, more nuanced understanding of the medieval mind and its terrifying capacity for self-immolation in the service of an ideal? To understand the profound psychological and spiritual machinery that compelled Odo de Saint-Amand to embrace death over deliverance, to choose the slow, agonizing extinction of the dungeon over the sunlight of freedom that was his for the asking, we must first penetrate the rigid, monastic fortress of the Templar rule. A codex so absolute in its demands and so terrifying in its implications that it governed not only how a knight fought and prayed but how he was permitted to be defeated, how he was commanded to conduct himself in the humiliation of captivity, and most crucially, how he was absolutely and irrevocably forbidden to return home through the payment of material goods to the enemies of Christ. The foundational text of the order, drafted by the fervent Cistercian Abbot Bernard of Clairvaux at the Council of Troyes in the year 1129, established the Templar as a new knighthood, a warrior whose soul was purified by strict obedience to a rule that was as much a spiritual constitution as a military manual, and whose body was a mere vessel for the will of God, destined to be broken on the anvil of holy war and discarded without sentiment when it had served its sacred purpose. Within this uncompromising framework, the concept of ransom, which was a standard, lucrative, and entirely honorable feature of secular medieval warfare, was viewed as a profound spiritual corruption, a transaction that placed a material price on a life that had already been surrendered to the service of the cross at the moment of the knight's solemn profession. A life that no longer belonged to the individual brother but to the order, to the church, and to Christ himself, and that could not, under any circumstances, be bartered back from the infidel with the gold and silver that were needed to defend the Holy Sepulchre and to feed the poor pilgrims who were the order's original charge. The rule dictated, with a stark, uncompromising clarity that left no room for interpretation or for the special pleading of the powerful, that a Templar knight was to possess nothing, not even his own will, which was surrendered entirely to the master and to the collective authority of the chapter. His armor, his horse, his sword, and his very existence were the property of the temple, held in trust for the defense of the Holy Land, and thus, to offer treasure to an infidel in exchange for a life that already belonged to Christ was to commit the dual sins of pride and simony, paying for what was ultimately a divine possession, stealing from the order's sacred treasury for the sake of a single, sinful soul, and placing the comfort of the individual above the collective mission of the brotherhood. This doctrine created a martyrdom cult of astonishing intensity, a culture in which capture was not a misfortune to be rectified by the pragmatic tools of diplomacy and finance but a divine test of purity, a final, grueling examination of the knight's detachment from the material world and his willingness to follow his vows to their ultimate, terrifying conclusion, and Odo de Saint-Amand, who had enforced these laws upon his subordinates for decades with a severity that bordered on tyranny, who had expelled brothers for far lesser infractions and had watched them perform their public penances without a flicker of mercy, was about to become their most famous and most rigorously tested subject, the man who would have to live and die by the very code that he had so mercilessly imposed on others. The specific regulation regarding the surrender of possessions in captivity, which would later be crystallized by Odo's own tragic eloquence and immortalized in the chronicles of the order, stripped a captive brother of every trapping of his former status and every material link to the world he had left behind, save for the simplest, most essential instruments of his survival and his piety, his belt and his dagger. The belt, or cincture, was not merely a functional item of clothing but a deeply symbolic cord that encircled the waist, symbolizing the chastity and binding obedience of the monastic soldier, a constant physical reminder of the vows he had sworn and the discipline to which he had submitted his body and his soul, a cord that could not be severed without severing the very identity of the knight as a Templar. The dagger, a simple, unadorned blade, represented the unbroken spirit of the warrior, a final tool for the defense of his person against the depredations of his captors or, in the darkest and most unspoken interpretations that were whispered in the dormitories but never officially recorded, for the ultimate escape from a dishonor so profound that death was the only remaining path to purity. The only way to prevent the infidel from extracting by torture the secrets of the order or the renunciation of the faith. Anything beyond these meager, symbolic items, a warhorse of immense value, a suit of chain mail that had cost a fortune in silver, a sack of gold bezants that could feed a garrison for a year, was the sacred property of the temple, consecrated to the defense of the Holy Land, and to offer such resources to the enemies of God to salvage a single life, no matter how high-ranking or how beloved, was considered a betrayal of the entire brotherhood, a theft from the collective mission, and a sin so grievous that it could only be expiated by the expulsion of the offender, and the eternal damnation of his soul. This was not merely a suggestion or a philosophical ideal to be honored in the breach. It was a strict penal code, enforced by the grim mechanisms of the chapter house, where the accused brother stood before his peers and faced the judgment of the master, and where the penalty for violating the prohibition on ransom was nothing less than the loss of the habit. The stripping of the white mantle that was the visible sign of the brother's election, an ignominious expulsion from the order, a fate that every Templar considered far worse than any physical death, for it condemned the soul to an eternity of shame, severed from the comradeship of the martyrs who had gone before, excluded from the prayers of the living brothers, and cast out into the outer darkness where there was no hope of redemption. Thus, when Saladin's guards, those hard, efficient Mamluk soldiers who had been trained since childhood to kill without hesitation and to obey without question, dragged the battered, bleeding Grand Master away from the blood-soaked field of Marjayan, they were not merely capturing a general, or a nobleman of high rank. They were seizing a man who, by his own strict legal definitions and by the unyielding code that he had spent a lifetime enforcing, was no longer permitted to have a financial value, a man whose continued existence in the material world was a technicality that his own order's theology could not accommodate, a man who was, in the eyes of the temple and in the cold, inexorable logic of the rule, already dead, already numbered among the blessed martyrs, and already beyond the reach of any rescue that the secular powers of the kingdom might attempt to orchestrate. The strategic landscape of the Latin kingdom in the spring of 1179 was a chessboard of extreme and escalating peril, a geopolitical nightmare in which every move was fraught with the possibility of catastrophic miscalculation, for Saladin, the Sultan of Egypt and Syria, had not only recovered from his humiliating defeat at Montcassar but had emerged from that crucible a far more formidable and far more dangerous adversary, a commander who had learned the hard lessons of his overconfidence, and who was now prosecuting a relentless, methodical campaign of attrition designed to bleed the Frankish state white through 1,000 small cuts rather than risk another decisive battle against the massed heavy cavalry that had shattered his army in 1177. The Sultan's forces were raiding the vulnerable, undefended agricultural lands of the Upper Galilee with a frequency and a ferocity that left the Frankish defenders reeling, burning the ripening harvests that were the lifeblood of the kingdom's economy, driving off the livestock, enslaving the peasant populations, and creating a tide of terrified refugees that flooded the overcrowded cities of Jerusalem, Acre, and Tyre, straining their resources to the breaking point and sowing the seeds of the famine and the despair that would, within a decade, bring the kingdom to its knees. King Baldwin IV, the tragic Leper King whose body was succumbing to the relentless ravages of Mycobacterium leprae but whose mind remained a rapier of military genius and strategic insight, had mustered the full feudal host of the realm at the springs of Sephoria, that ancient, well-watered assembly point in the hills of Galilee that had served as the staging ground for Frankish armies since the days of the First Crusade. Determined to intercept Saladin's marauding columns, to protect the vital grain supplies that sustained the Crusader cities and the Templar and Hospitaller castles, and to demonstrate to the watching Muslim world that the Franks, despite their internal divisions and their dwindling resources, were still a force to be reckoned with. Accompanying the king on this crucial, high-stakes campaign was the full, formidable might of the Knights Templar, commanded personally by Odo de Saint-Amand, who rode at the head of his white-mantled brothers with the serene, terrifying confidence of a man who believed that God marched beside him, along with the Knights Hospitaller under their pragmatic master Roger of Moulins, and the secular lords of the realm, including the brilliant but controversial Raymond III of Tripoli, the leader of the Dove faction whose advocacy for a negotiated truce with Saladin had earned him the bitter enmity of the Hawks and the whispered accusations of treason that swirled around his name like a poisonous miasma. This was a formidable but deeply unwieldy coalition of rival egos, competing tactical doctrines, and mutually suspicious factions, a military force that was capable of immense coordinated power when united behind a single purpose, but that was perpetually on the verge of fragmenting into its constituent parts under the pressure of the conflicting ideologies and personal animosities that had been simmering since the earliest days of Baldwin's reign. The immediate spark that ignited the campaign and set the stage for the disaster was Saladin's aggressive probe into the region around the ancient Templar fortress of Safed, that massive stone citadel perched high above the Jordan Valley whose garrison kept watch over the surrounding countryside and whose loss would be a strategic catastrophe of the first magnitude. A probe that the Sultan designed specifically to draw the Frankish army into the field and to test the cohesion of its command structure, a test that Odo de Saint-Amand, with his burning impatience and his contempt for the cautious, defensive posture that the Doves advocated, was about to fail in the most spectacular and catastrophic manner imaginable. The intelligence reports that filtered into the Frankish camp, gathered by the native Syrian Christian scouts whose knowledge of the terrain was unmatched and by the Bedouin trackers whose loyalty had been purchased with the gold bezants of the royal treasury, indicated that Saladin had dispersed a significant portion of his vast army across the countryside around the Litani River, sending out foraging parties to strip the land of its remaining resources and spreading his forces thin in a manner that was, in retrospect, a deliberate and brilliantly executed bait, a trap designed to lure the aggressive Templar commander into a premature and ill-supported attack. To Odo de Saint-Amand, who saw the world through the lens of the Templar rule and who regarded every Saracen as a god-given target for the Holy Lance, this dispersal of enemy forces appeared not as a trap but as a golden, heaven-sent opportunity, a chance to strike a detached wing of the Ayyubid host with the full, concentrated weight of the Templar wedge, to repeat the heroics of Montgessard, to cover the white mantle in fresh glory, and to prove to the doubting Doves and the cautious barons that the aggressive, offensive strategy of the Hawks was the only path to victory. The geography of the Upper Galilee, a rugged, deceptively beautiful tapestry of volcanic basalt ridges, deep-cut wadis that could swallow an unwary horseman, and deceptive open meadows that looked like perfect cavalry country but concealed a labyrinth of hidden ravines and rocky defile, became a silent, impassive accomplice in the coming tragedy, its gentle, sunlit appearance masking the deadly vulnerability of heavy cavalry trapped in unfamiliar terrain, a trap that Saladin, with his intimate knowledge of the land and his mastery of the tactical arts, had prepared with the cold, meticulous precision of a master predator. On the 10th of June, a day that would live in infamy in the annals of the Temple, Baldwin IV advanced his combined forces into the fertile basin of Marjayan, the Valley of Springs, a region of lush pasture and scattered woodlands situated between the Litani and Hispani rivers, establishing a main camp to protect the infantry and the supply train while dispatching a powerful reconnaissance in force under the joint command of Raymond III of Tripoli and Odo de Saint-Amand, two men whose mutual contempt and whose diametrically opposed approaches to warfare were a recipe for disaster. Raymond, ever the cautious pragmatist whose years of captivity in Aleppo had taught him to respect the tactical cunning of the Muslim armies, sought only to confirm the precise location and strength of the Sultan's foraging parties and to withdraw with this intelligence to the main camp, preserving the army for a larger, more decisive engagement under conditions that favored the Frankish heavy cavalry. Odo de Saint-Amand, burning with the humiliation of a defensive war that had reduced his proud knights to impotent spectators behind the walls of their castles, and consumed by the sacred impatience of the Templar spirit that demanded immediate, aggressive action against the enemies of God, saw only a fleeing, vulnerable foe ripe for extermination. A flock of infidels waiting to be scattered like chaff before the wind by the charge of God's own knights. A charge that would not only destroy the enemy but would silence the cowardly, defeatist whispers of the Dove faction once and for all. The fatal split in command philosophy, the irreconcilable tension between the pragmatic restraint of the secular lord and the fanatical aggression of the warrior monk, was about to tear the Frankish reconnaissance apart. The preliminary skirmishing that ignited the Battle of Marj Ayyun began in the early afternoon of that fateful June day, when the Frankish reconnaissance column, advancing cautiously through the sun-drenched, deceptively peaceful meadows of the valley, made contact with Saladin's advance guard, a highly mobile, superbly trained force of Turkic horse archers and Bedouin light cavalry under the brilliant, energetic command of his nephew, Taqi al-Din, whose tactical genius for the art of the feigned retreat had been honed to perfection through years of desert warfare and who was about to execute one of the most devastatingly effective ambushes in the long, bloody history of the Crusader-Muslim conflict. The Muslim light cavalry, upon sighting the approaching Frankish column with its banners and its gleaming armor, immediately began their signature, maddeningly effective tactic of the feigned retreat, turning their horses and galloping away in apparent panic, loosing a sporadic, stinging hail of arrows over their shoulders as they fled. A performance so convincing in its simulated terror that it would have deceived a far more cautious commander than the impetuous Grand Master of the Temple. Odo de Saint-Amand, riding at the head of his Templar squadron on his massive, grey, battle-scarred destrier, his white mantle billowing in the hot wind, his helmet closed and his lance couched, observed the fleeing Saracens with a contemptuous, predatory glare. His blood boiling with the accumulated frustrations of months of defensive warfare and with the memory of the recent Muslim raids that had devastated the Templar agricultural estates, burned their mills, and enslaved their peasants. And he convinced himself, with the unshakable, fatal certainty of a zealot who saw the hand of God in every tactical opportunity, that a swift, decisive charge would collapse the enemy's morale before the main battle could even be joined. Despite the explicit, well-established tactical doctrine of the Frankish army, a doctrine that had been refined over decades of hard-won experience, and that dictated with absolute clarity that the heavy cavalry must maintain a tight, cohesive formation and must coordinate its movements with the infantry crossbowmen whose bolts could keep the mobile Muslim archers at bay, the Grand Master, in an act of breathtaking insubordination that was either magnificent heroism or catastrophic folly, ordered his white-mantled brothers to couch their lances and spur their massive, half-ton destriers into a full, thundering gallop, plunging down the gentle, grassy slope into the valley floor in a tidal wave of iron, horseflesh, and blazing red crosses that was, by any standard, one of the most magnificent and terrifying sights that the medieval battlefield had ever witnessed. It was a charge that would have shattered a less disciplined enemy, a charge that would have been celebrated in song and chronicle if it had struck a static line of infantry or a mass formation of heavy cavalry. But it was a wave that was crashing directly into a vacuum, a trap that had been laid with the cold, meticulous precision of a chess grandmaster, for the nimble, swift Turkic horse archers, who had trained since childhood in the arts of mounted combat, and who could shoot their composite bows with deadly accuracy from the saddle at a full gallop, simply melted away to the flanks and to the rear, refusing to engage the Templar wedge on its own terms, loosing a constant, withering hail of armor-piercing arrows as they retreated, arrows that struck the Templar armor with a sound like hail on a slate roof and that emptied saddle after saddle, sending knights crashing to the ground in a chaos of broken lances, screaming horses, and the choked, desperate cries of the dying. The moment the Templar wedge, its momentum spent, its formation shattered, and its knights scattered across the valley floor in isolated, vulnerable clusters, lost its cohesion and its terrifying forward impetus. Saladin, who had been observing the unfolding chaos from a nearby, carefully chosen hilltop with the cold, calculating eye of a master strategist who had spent years studying the strengths and weaknesses of his enemy, unleashed the full, devastating weight of his counterstroke. A perfectly timed, brilliantly coordinated pincer movement that had been prepared in advance, and that was executed with the seamless precision of a parade ground drill. Taqi al-Din's heavy Kurdish cavalry, the iron fist of the Ayyubid army, armed with long lances and riding magnificent Arabian horses, swung around the isolated Frankish squadron from the north, cutting off any avenue of retreat back to the safety of the main Crusader camp, while the elite Mamluk guard, the slave soldiers whose entire existence was dedicated to the service of the Sultan, and whose discipline and courage were the equal of any knights in Christendom, closed the trap from the south. A great, green-bannered fist of scimitars and screaming warriors that descended on the scattered, exhausted, and utterly demoralized Templars with the fury of a desert storm. The panic that ensued was catastrophic and instantaneous, a chain reaction of terror that spread through the entire Frankish reconnaissance force like a fire through dry grass. The secular knights, seeing the supposedly invincible Templars swallowed by a sea of green banners and flashing scimitars, broke formation and attempted to flee in a desperate, disorganized rout, colliding with their own infantry in a crush of screaming men and terrified horses that turned the narrow defile of the valley into a charnel house of trampled bodies, abandoned weapons, and the pitiful, unheeded cries of the wounded who were crushed beneath the hooves of their own comrades. King Baldwin IV, his leprous body strapped to his warhorse with leather bands that cut into his insensate flesh, his hands curled into useless claws, and his voice reduced to a hoarse, rasping whisper by the lesions that were consuming his throat, could only watch from a distant ridge as the flower of his heavy cavalry was annihilated in a catastrophe that his physical condition rendered him powerless to prevent, or even to influence. A nightmare unfolding before his burning, fevered eyes that must have felt like the death of the kingdom itself. The Grand Master himself, fighting with the ferocity of a cornered lion and the desperate, unyielding courage that was the hallmark of his order, laid about him with his heavy, double-edged blade, felling several of Saladin's elite bodyguards in a whirlwind of steel and blood, his armor dented and gashed, his white mantle stained crimson with the mingled blood of his enemies and his own wounds, alone. Defiant figure standing against the tide of the Ayyubid advance, but his magnificent destrier, the faithful companion that had carried him through a dozen battles, was shot out from under him by a concentrated, point-blank volley of arrows that struck the great beast in the chest and the neck, and he was pinned beneath its dying, thrashing bulk, his helmet torn from his head by the force of the fall, his consciousness flickering, a pool of his own blood and the blood of his foes staining the thirsty, sun-baked soil of Marj Ayan as the rough, calloused hands of the victorious Mamluks seized him and dragged him, battered, bleeding, and barely conscious, into a captivity that would test the very foundations of his fanatical faith and that would, in the fullness of time, transform him from a defeated general into an immortal legend. The capture of the Templar Grand Master was not a minor skirmish or a routine incident of frontier warfare but a seismic, earth-shaking event that sent shockwaves of disbelief, exultation, and terror through both the Christian and Muslim worlds. For Odo de Saint-Amand was not merely a nobleman of high rank or a general of considerable skill. He was the physical, living embodiment of the Temple's terrifying military power, the very man who had shattered Saladin's army at Montgassard and who had, in the years since that miraculous victory, become the most feared and the most respected Frankish commander in the entire Levant, a figure whose name was spoken with awe in the chapter houses of Europe and with a mixture of hatred and grudging admiration in the courts of the Muslim emirs. The Sultan, whose chivalry was as legendary as his patience, and whose understanding of the political and symbolic dimensions of warfare was unmatched in his generation, immediately recognized the immense, almost incalculable value of his prize, and rather than executing the Grand Master on the spot as he would later do to the treacherous Reynold of Chatillon, whose violations of truces and whose insults to the Prophet had placed him beyond the reach of even Saladin's fabled mercy, he ordered Odo to be treated with a degree of harsh, contemptuous respect. His wounds tended to by the Sultan's own physicians to prevent the valuable captive from dying of his injuries before his political utility could be extracted, but his limbs bound in heavy, rusted iron chains that bit cruelly into his flesh and that would, in the months to come, become instruments of slow, grinding torture, a constant, agonizing reminder of his fall from the heights of glory to the depths of abjection. The Templar, even in the utter humiliation of defeat, even as he was paraded before the jeering Muslim soldiers and the curious, contemptuous eyes of the Sultan's court, radiated an aura of unbroken, almost supernatural defiance. His dark, piercing eyes, set in a face that was scarred and weathered by a lifetime of war and that had been further battered by the violence of his capture, refusing to acknowledge the Sultan's authority, to lower his gaze, or to show the slightest flicker of fear or submission, a silent, seething, utterly immovable pride that the Muslim chroniclers, including the great historian and secretary Imad ad-Din al-Isfahani, whose elegant, flowing Arabic prose recorded the events of Saladin's reign for posterity, noted with a mixture of contempt for the infidel's arrogance and a grudging, unwilling awe for a courage that seemed to transcend the normal human boundaries of self-preservation. For Saladin, the capture of Odo was not merely a military trophy to be displayed and celebrated but a golden, almost providential political lever, a means to recover several high-ranking emirs and irreplaceable Mamluk military commanders who had fallen into Frankish hands during the earlier, inconclusive skirmishing of the campaign, and whose release would significantly strengthen the Ayyubid military machine. A pragmatic, mutually beneficial exchange that was standard procedure in the delicate, sophisticated, and often surprisingly cordial diplomacy of 12th century Levantine warfare, where a captive's value was strictly and rationally measured in dinars, in political advantage, and in the number of enemy soldiers whose freedom could be secured in return. Thus began the formal, meticulously conducted negotiations, with messengers riding under the sacred, inviolable flags of truce, shuttling between the Sultan's opulent, silk-draped campaign tent, where the captured Grand Master sat in chains, and the royal court of Jerusalem, where the Leper King Baldwin IV, despite his rapidly deteriorating health, the constant, agonizing pain of his lesions, and the bitter, corrosive recriminations that were tearing his court apart in the aftermath of the disaster at Marjayan, sought desperately to salvage the kingdom's military leadership from the wreckage of the catastrophe and to prevent the complete collapse of the Templar command structure at a moment when the Ayyubid threat was more menacing than ever. Saladin's initial offer was surprisingly generous and strictly, coldly transactional in its logic. He would release the Grand Master of the Temple, along with several other noble Frankish captives of lesser rank, in return for the immediate, unconditional liberation of his veteran nephew Taqi al-Din's most trusted and experienced senior lieutenants. Men whose tactical knowledge and whose personal loyalty were essential to the smooth functioning of the Ayyubid military machine, and a collection of seasoned, battle-hardened Mamluk officers who were currently languishing in the damp, rat-infested dungeons of Acre and Tyre, their valuable military skills going to waste in the darkness of Frankish captivity. For the secular barons and for King Baldwin, who was a pragmatist at heart despite the deep, sincere piety that suffused his suffering existence. This was a deal of immediate, undeniable strategic logic. A way to repatriate the most feared and the most tactically brilliant military commander in the entire Latin East without draining the already bankrupt and desperately overstretched royal treasury of a single silver bezant that was urgently needed to repair the kingdom's shattered fortifications, to pay the arrears of the mercenary garrisons, and to purchase the grain that was needed to feed the starving refugees who were flooding into the overcrowded cities. But the negotiators on the Frankish side, experienced diplomats though they were, had failed to account for a variable that rendered all their careful, pragmatic calculations utterly irrelevant, a variable that belonged not to the realm of politics or strategy but to the dark, uncompromising theology of the temple and to the implacable, suicidal pride of the captive himself. Odo de Saint-Amand did not view his captivity as a setback to be bargained away by the pragmatic tools of diplomacy and finance, but as a divine summons, a sacred vocation, a final, ultimate act of self-mortification and spiritual witness that had been ordained by God Himself to test the purity of his faith and to demonstrate to the entire world, Christian and Muslim alike, that the Templar rule was not merely a collection of dead letters inscribed on parchment, but a living, breathing, and if necessary, dying truth. A truth that could only be fully realized through the total, willing sacrifice of the self on the altar of obedience. For the Grand Master, the negotiations, the offers of exchange, the well-meaning attempts of his king and his comrades to secure his release, were not acts of loyalty or friendship but insidious temptations, whispers of the devil designed to lure him away from the narrow, stony path of martyrdom and into the broad, comfortable, and ultimately damnable road of compromise, and he was determined, with every fiber of his indomitable being, to resist that temptation, to remain true to the vows he had sworn, and to embrace the slow, agonizing death that awaited him in the darkness of the Damascus dungeons as the supreme, culminating act of a life that had been dedicated, from the moment of his profession, to the service of the cross. When the Frankish negotiators, escorted under a pristine white flag of truce that was respected by both sides with the scrupulous, almost religious formality that characterized the chivalric code of the 12th century, finally arrived at the Sultan's forward encampment near Damascus to finalize the details of the proposed exchange, they were conducted through the bustling, colorful, and intimidating chaos of the Muslim camp, past the picketed lines of magnificent Arabian horses, the squads of Mamluk guards who watched them with cold, expressionless eyes, and the opulent tents of the emirs, to the heavily guarded, dimly lit pavilion where the Grand Master was being held in solitary confinement, his chains bolted to a massive iron stake driven deep into the hard-packed earth. The scene that greeted them was one of such stark, almost theatrical austerity and such profound, unsettling dignity that it struck the hardened diplomats, men who had negotiated with sultans and caliphs and who had thought themselves immune to surprise, with the force of a physical blow, Odo de Saint-Amand, his once pristine white mantle, the sacred garment that symbolized his purity and his vocation, now a soiled, torn, blood-stained rag that barely covered his emaciated frame, had refused the cushions, the refreshments, and the small comforts that his Muslim captors, in accordance with the chivalric code that Saladin insisted upon for high-ranking prisoners, had offered him, sitting instead on the bare, filthy, packed dirt floor of the tent, his back ramrod straight against the rough canvas wall, his raw, bloody wrists cuffed in heavy iron manacles that had been deliberately fitted too tightly and that had worn deep, suppurating, foul-smelling sores into his flesh, sores that were already beginning to fester and to attract the buzzing, black flies that crawled over his prone form with an insolent, proprietary boldness. Yet despite the squalor of his condition, the degradation of his physical state, and the pain that must have been a constant, gnawing agony, the Grand Master's posture was as erect and as rigid as if he were seated in the chapter house of the temple in Jerusalem, presiding over the solemn judgment of a wayward brother, and his dark, piercing eyes, set in a face that was gaunt, hollow-cheeked, and scarred by a lifetime of combat, betrayed no flicker of fear, no hint of the despair that the Sultan's jailers had expected to see in a man who had been offered freedom, and who had only to speak a single word of assent to secure his release. As the envoys, their voices carefully neutral and their faces schooled to diplomatic impassivity, explained the terms of the proposed ransom, the exchange of high-value prisoners that had been laboriously negotiated with the Sultan, the royal decree of King Baldwin IV authorizing the transaction and expressing the king's deep, personal concern for the Grand Master's welfare, and the logistical arrangements that had been made for his safe transport back to Jerusalem. Odo de Saint-Amand listened in a stony, unnerving silence, his scarred, hawk-like face betraying not the slightest flicker of emotion, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere far beyond the canvas walls of the tent, as if he were already gazing into the next world, into the paradise that was reserved for the martyrs who had given their lives in the service of the cross, and finding the offers of this world, with all its compromises and its pragmatic calculations, pathetically, contemptibly insufficient. When the envoys had finished their carefully prepared presentation, their voices trailing off into an expectant, uncomfortable silence, expecting the Grand Master to express gratitude, relief, or at the very least the grudging acceptance of the king's efforts on his behalf, Odo de Saint-Amand rose slowly, painfully to his feet, the heavy iron chains that bound his wrists and ankles clanking a grim, discordant death knell that echoed through the silent tent like the tolling of a funeral bell, and he delivered, in a voice that was hoarse and weakened by his privations but that still carried the unmistakable, unyielding ring of absolute, immovable authority, the response that would instantly become one of the most famous and most chilling quotations in the entire 800-year history of the Crusades, a single, stark sentence that encapsulated the terrifying, inhuman logic of the warrior monk, and that would be repeated, with awe and with a shudder, around the campfires and in the chapter houses of Christendom for generations to come. A Templar could offer no ransom for his life but his belt and his dagger. The statement, a stark, uncompromising distillation of the Order's absolute prohibition against the payment of any material goods, any silver, any gold, any political concessions, to the infidel in exchange for the life of a professed knight, was not merely a declaration of personal courage or a dramatic gesture of defiance designed to impress his captors and his comrades. It was a profound, carefully reasoned theological and juridical argument that placed the sacred, inviolable laws of the temple above the commands of the king, above the pragmatic needs of the kingdom, and above the natural, God-given instinct for self-preservation that every human being, from the humblest peasant to the mightiest emperor, shared. The belt, the simple, unadorned cord of chastity that girded his loins, represented his vows, his obedience to God, and his total, irrevocable commitment to the celibate, ascetic life of the warrior monk, a symbol that could be surrendered to no earthly power, not to the Sultan, not to the king, and not even to the Pope himself, for it was the visible sign of a covenant that had been sealed in heaven. The dagger, the simple, unadorned blade that was the only weapon left to a captive who had been stripped of his sword and his lance, was the instrument of his last, desperate defense against the enemies who surrounded him, and, in the dark, unspoken subtext of Templar doctrine that was whispered in the dormitories but never officially acknowledged, the tool of his final, ultimate release should the despair and the dishonor of prolonged captivity threaten to overcome his will and to lead him into the temptation of renouncing his faith or revealing the secrets of his order. To offer a sack of gold bezants, or the freedom of a high-ranking Saracen emir in exchange for his broken, suffering body was, in Odo's ferocious, unforgiving theology, to commit the sin of simony, to place a material, worldly price on a life that had already been consecrated to the service of the Holy Sepulchre at the moment of his solemn profession. To insult the divine providence that had ordained his capture as a test of his faith, to steal precious, irreplaceable resources from the defense of the Holy Land for the sake of a single, sinful, and ultimately insignificant soul, and to betray the entire brotherhood of the Temple by setting a precedent that would weaken the Order's resolve and that would, in the long run, cost far more lives than his own solitary existence could ever justify. The envoys, hardened, experienced diplomats though they were, men who had negotiated with sultans and caliphs and who had thought themselves immune to the shock of the unexpected, were struck utterly speechless by the immovable, granite finality of the declaration, for they recognized, with a sinking, horrified certainty, that they were not negotiating with a general, or a politician, or a man who could be swayed by the rational calculus of costs and benefits. They were witnessing, in real time, the living, breathing martyrdom of a man who had already died to the world, who had already surrendered his soul to God, and who was merely waiting, with a serene, terrifying patience, for his body to follow suit, a man who had chosen the slow, solitary, agonizing death of the dungeon over the seeming dishonor of a negotiated liberty, and who would not be moved from his chosen path by any argument, any plea, or any inducement that the mortal world could offer. The refusal sent ripples of disbelief, consternation, and in some quarters, a kind of horrified admiration through the diplomatic channels of both the Frankish and Ayyubid courts, for it violated, with a stark, uncompromising finality, every unspoken rule of the aristocratic game of medieval warfare, a game in which high-born prisoners, particularly men of the Grand Master's immense rank and political significance, were regarded as valuable, negotiable commodities to be traded with dignity, with profit, and with the mutual respect that one nobleman owed to another, even across the chasm of religious enmity, not discarded like common foot soldiers or left to rot like the anonymous, forgotten peasants who filled the mass graves of the battlefields. The secular barons of the Latin kingdom, who had spent their entire lives operating within the flexible, pragmatic framework of feudal ransom culture, could not comprehend the rigid, absolute logic that had driven Odo to his decision. To them, the Grand Master's refusal was not an act of heroic martyrdom, but a form of insanity. A suicidal pride that was depriving the kingdom of its most formidable military commander at a moment when his leadership was desperately needed to counter the mounting Ayyubid threat, and they whispered among themselves, in the corridors of the royal palace and the chambers of the haute cour, that the Templar fanaticism, however admirable in its abstract purity, had finally crossed the line from courage into madness, from devotion into self-destruction, and that the Order's obsession with its own internal codes of honor was becoming a strategic liability that threatened the survival of the entire Crusader enterprise. King Baldwin IV, receiving the devastating news in his dim, incense-choked sick room in the Tower of David, where the air was thick with the scent of the medicinal herbs that the physicians burned constantly to mask the odor of his decaying flesh, felt a complex, tangled surge of emotions that he, even with his formidable intelligence and his deep self-awareness, could not fully disentangle, a profound, aching admiration for the sheer, unyielding, unbreakable courage of his most difficult and most insubordinate ally, a man who had defied him on countless occasions but whose valor on the battlefield had saved the kingdom at Montgassard, and a cold, sinking, strategic despair, for the loss of the Grand Master's tactical genius, his terrifying presence on the battlefield, and his ability to inspire his knights to feats of suicidal bravery, at this critical juncture. With Saladin's forces massing on the frontiers and the political situation within the kingdom deteriorating by the day, was a blow from which the kingdom's already fractured and faction-ridden military command structure might never fully recover. The king, who himself understood, with an intimacy that no healthy man could ever approach, the profound, mysterious relationship between bodily suffering and unbreakable spiritual will, could not force Odo to accept the ransom, even if he had wanted to. The Templar Order was technically a sovereign, independent entity, answering directly to the Pope in Rome and owing only a nominal, contested allegiance to the crown of Jerusalem, and any attempt by the king to override the Grand Master's deeply held religious convictions, to impose a secular, political solution on a man who had chosen the path of martyrdom, would not only fail in the most humiliating and public manner possible but would shatter the already fragile, desperately strained alliance between the crown and the temple, an alliance upon which the entire military defense of the kingdom depended. Thus, Baldwin, the Leper King, the boy who had been crowned in a tomb and who had led the charge at Montcassard, was forced to watch in impotent, agonized silence as the most formidable warrior in his realm, the man who had stood beside him in the miracle of 1177 and who had driven Saladin fleeing into the desert on a pack camel, voluntarily returned to the chains of the Sultan, walking, or rather being dragged, back into the all-consuming darkness of his captivity with the serene, terrifying calm of a martyr who has already ascended the scaffold, who has already made his peace with God, and for whom the continued existence of his body in the material world is merely a tedious, irrelevant formality, a final, minor inconvenience to be endured before the eternal glory of paradise can be claimed. The king, in the long, sleepless nights that followed, his body a furnace of pain and his mind a whirlwind of strategic calculations, must have reflected on the bitter, tragic irony that the very fanaticism which made the Templars the most formidable and the most feared warriors in all of Christendom, the unshakable, absolute conviction that death in the service of the cross was the highest honor and the surest path to salvation, was the same fanaticism that was now, in the hour of the kingdom's greatest need, leaving his army without its most experienced and most brilliant commander, a fatal, irreparable flaw in the diamond-hard perfection of the Order's ideology, a crack through which the coming storm of Saladin's jihad would ultimately pour, sweeping the kingdom, its castles, its churches, and its holy places, into the oblivion of history. Saladin, for his part, was as baffled as he was impressed by the Grand Master's refusal, for his intimate, sophisticated knowledge of Frankish chivalry, acquired through years of careful observation and diplomatic interaction with the Crusader lords, had led him to expect from his high-born captives a predictable mixture of greed, political calculation, or at the very least a healthy, robust instinct for self-preservation, not this stark, chilling, almost inhuman absolutism that seemed to belong more to the legends of the desert hermits and the early Christian martyrs than to the leader of a wealthy, politically powerful, and internationally connected military order that controlled vast estates and commanded the loyalty of thousands of knights across Europe. The Sultan, who had met fanatics before and who had, on many occasions, exploited their predictability for his own strategic advantage, had never encountered a man who wielded his own suffering as a weapon, who transformed his squalid dungeon cell into a pulpit from which he preached a silent, devastating sermon on the power of faith, and whose refusal to be bought, to be bargained, to be compromised in any way, solidified the terrifying, almost supernatural reputation of the Templars as warriors who truly, absolutely, and without reservation did not fear death, an enemy whose morale could not be broken by defeat or by capture because their ultimate, long-awaited victory lay not on the temporary, shifting battlefields of the Holy Land but in the grave, in the paradise that was promised to those who died in the service of the cross. Faced with a prisoner who actively, stubbornly, and with a kind of serene, infuriating joy sabotaged his own release, who refused to cooperate with the very negotiations that were designed to secure his freedom, and who seemed to regard his continued captivity not as a misfortune but as a divine gift, Saladin, after consulting with his closest advisors and weighing the political and symbolic implications of his decision, had little choice but to order Odo de Saint-Amand transferred from the relative comfort of the forward encampment to the deepest, most secure, most lightless dungeon of the ancient citadel of Damascus, a labyrinth of cold, black, sweating basalt and dripping, phosphorescent moisture that was known throughout the Muslim world as the prison of the Franks, a place where the light of the sun was a forgotten, distant memory, where the passage of day and night could not be measured, and where the only sounds were the incessant, maddening scurrying of the rats, the constant, rhythmic drip of water from the ceiling, and the distant, echoing, despairing moans of the other prisoners, men who had been left to rot in the darkness for decades, their minds shattered by the solitude, their bodies reduced to living skeletons, their bones, when they finally died, left to mingle with the ancient, accursed stones of the citadel as a grim warning to any who would defy the will of the Sultan. The dungeons of the Damascus citadel in the late 12th century were a subterranean hell, a realm of perpetual, suffocating darkness and icy, bone-penetrating damp that had been deliberately designed, through centuries of grim, pragmatic experience in the arts of incarceration and psychological torture, to break the bodies and the spirits of even the most hardened, the most resilient, and the most defiant warriors, a place where the black, stagnant water, foul with the accumulated filth of decades and the rotting remains of previous prisoners, seeped from the sweating, glistening basalt walls, pooling in stagnant, stinking puddles on the slimy, uneven floor and breeding the pestilential fevers, the agues, and the consumptions that killed more captives, slowly and agonizingly, than any executioner's blade or any hangman's noose could ever hope to dispatch. It was into this abyss, this antechamber of the grave, that Odo de Saint Amand was cast, his heavy, rusted iron fetters, which had already worn deep, suppurating grooves into the flesh of his wrists and his ankles, bolted securely to the unyielding, icy cold stone of the dungeon wall to ensure that even in the brief, fitful moments of exhausted sleep that his tormented body could snatch from the relentless, grinding agony of his captivity, he would find no respite, no comfort, no momentary escape from the cold, gnawing, ever-present pain of his restraints and the crushing, suffocating weight of the darkness that pressed in on him from all sides like a physical, malignant presence. The diet provided to high-ranking prisoners in the Sultan's dungeons was, in its own way, a calculated cruelty, a slow, insidious form of execution that was designed to stretch out the process of dying over months or even years, maximizing the suffering of the captive while absolving the executioner of the direct responsibility for his death. A few meager, mold-crusted morsels of stale, black bread, so hard that it had to be soaked in the brackish water of the dungeon to be made even remotely edible, and a single cup of foul, murky, lukewarm water each day, just enough to keep the faint, guttering spark of life flickering in the prisoner's chest, but utterly, pitifully insufficient to sustain the strength of the once mighty limbs that had wielded a great sword with the devastating force of a falling tree, that had controlled a half-ton destrier with the subtle pressure of a knee, and that had, in the glory days of Montgassard, driven the Sultan himself fleeing into the desert on a pack camel. The predictable, inevitable result of this regimen of deliberate, calculated starvation was that the Grand Master, like every other prisoner who was condemned to the darkness of the citadel, would slowly, inexorably, and agonizingly waste away, his muscles, deprived of the protein and the nourishment that they needed to sustain themselves, atrophying and shrinking, his skin, once tanned and leathery from years of campaigning under the Middle Eastern sun, growing pale, translucent, and tight. over his prominent, jutting bones, his body, that magnificent, disciplined engine of holy war that had served him so faithfully for so many decades, consuming itself in the darkness, feeding on its own substance in a desperate, futile attempt to keep the spark of life burning for just one more day, just one more hour, just one more prayer. Yet the Muslim jailers, those hard, unsentimental men who had spent their entire careers in the grim, soul-deadening profession of incarceration and who had seen the mightiest emirs, the proudest princes, and the most arrogant Frankish barons reduced, by the relentless, grinding pressure of the oubliette, to weeping, incoherent, crawling wrecks who begged for the mercy of a swift death, reported, with a mixture of superstitious fear and grudging, unwilling respect, that the Templar leader remained utterly, mystifyingly unbroken, his spirit, if not his body, as fierce and as defiant as it had been on the day he was dragged, bleeding and battered, from the field of Marj Ayan. His voice, though weakened by the starvation, the dehydration, and the constant, gnawing pain of his untreated wounds, was still raised, at the appointed hours that only he could discern in the perpetual darkness of his cell, in the solemn, rhythmic, ancient Latin chants of the divine office, the psalms of David, the prayers of the monastic hours that he had recited every day since his novitiate, echoing through the black, dank, stinking corridors of the prison like the voice of a ghost, a disembodied spirit that had already transcended its decaying, suffering flesh and that now stood, armored in the impenetrable light of divine grace, before the throne of the God for whose service it had willingly, joyfully given everything that the mortal world had to offer and had received, in return, the black, cold, rat-infested silence of the Damascus dungeon as its final, most precious reward. Odo's imprisonment was not, however, a state of passive, stoic endurance, a mere waiting for the slow, inevitable release of death. It was, in his own mind and in the interpretation that the Templar chroniclers would later place upon his suffering, a final, defiant, triumphant campaign of spiritual warfare, a crusade waged not with the sword and the lance but with the weapons of prayer, of self-denial, and of the unbreakable, adamantine will that no amount of physical torture could shatter. Because its foundation was not in the mortal body but in the immortal soul. He transformed his squalid, lightless, vermin-infested confinement into a monastic cell, a sacred space consecrated by his suffering and by his unwavering devotion, praying the canonical hours with the same rigid, meticulous discipline that he had enforced, with an iron hand, in the preceptories of Jerusalem and Acre, and though there was no brother to witness his piety, no chaplain to grant him the comfort of absolution, no altar before which to kneel, he conducted himself as if the eyes of the entire order, past, present, and future, were upon him, as if every knight who would ever don the white mantle would be judged by the standard that he was now setting in the darkness of his dungeon, understanding, with the cold, clear, unblinking clarity of the true martyr, that his fate would become a legend, a sacred tale. A foundational myth that would be told and retold in the chapter houses and the dormitories of the temple for as long as the order endured, a standard against which future generations of Templars would measure their own courage and find themselves, inevitably, wanting. The sores on his wrists and ankles, caused by the constant, unyielding pressure and the rusted, jagged edges of the iron manacles, festered and stank, suppurating a foul, yellowish discharge that attracted the bold, black rats that shared his cell, creatures that scurried over his emaciated, prone form in the darkness, their cold, sharp claws scratching his skin, their whiskers twitching as they investigated the source of the rotting, necrotic smell, yet he refused to cry out, to plead with his jailers for the removal of the chains or for the basic, rudimentary medical attention that might have slowed the progress of the infection that was slowly, inexorably poisoning his blood, treating the fetters not as instruments of torture but as a hair shirt, a voluntary, self-imposed penance for the sins of pride and recklessness that had led to the disaster at Marj Ayan. For the deaths of the beloved brothers who had followed him into the trap and whose faces, young, eager, and full of faith, haunted his feverish, hallucinatory dreams in the darkness of the endless Damascus nights. The Sultan, who received periodic, laconic reports on the deteriorating state of his most famous and most stubborn prisoner, is said to have shaken his head in a mixture of genuine, unwilling admiration and profound, almost anthropological bewilderment, for he could not comprehend a code of honor, a system of belief, that required a man of such immense power, such high rank, and such proven military genius to suffer so profoundly, so unnecessarily, so utterly against every instinct of self-preservation, when a single word of concession, a single nod of acceptance, a single, grudging agreement to the terms of the exchange that had been laid before him, would have restored him in an instant to the sunlight, to the command of his knights, to the war that he claimed to love above all else, and to the company of his king and his comrades. While the Grand Master endured his slow, agonizing, meticulously self-inflicted martyrdom in the black, silent depths of the Damascus citadel, the consequences of his absence reverberated through the political and military structures of the Latin kingdom like the relentless, widening aftershocks of a catastrophic earthquake, destabilizing the already fragile, desperately strained balance of power between the doves and the hawks, creating a dangerous, demoralizing leadership vacuum in the Templar Order at the worst possible moment, and setting in motion a chain of events that would have fatal, irreversible repercussions in the years leading inexorably toward the ultimate catastrophe of the Horns of Hattin. The temple, suddenly, violently decapitated of its most charismatic, its most aggressive, and its most feared leader, fell into a period of strategic confusion, drift, and bitter, internal recrimination. The interim commanders, competent and loyal but lacking Odo's immense, almost supernatural personal authority, his terrifying battlefield charisma that could inspire his knights to feats of suicidal bravery, and his unshakable, burning conviction that the Templar sword, wielded in faith, was invincible, struggled to maintain the cohesion of the order and to assert its traditional, aggressive policies against the renewed, vigorous diplomatic offensive of the Dove faction, led by Raymond of Tripoli, who used Odo's catastrophic defeat and subsequent captivity as a powerful, irrefutable argument to justify his controversial policy of truces, negotiations, and pragmatic accommodation with Saladin, a policy that the Grand Master, had he been present, would have fought with every fiber of his being and every resource at his command. The Templar treasury, already strained to the breaking point by the immense, unrelenting costs of garrisoning the great frontier castles, purchasing the war horses and the armor that were the essential tools of the Order's trade, and ransoming the lesser knights and the sergeants who had fallen into Muslim hands during the constant, grinding skirmishes of the war of attrition, was now placed in a paradoxical, almost unbearable situation, a cruel trap laid by the very doctrine that Odo was now dying to uphold. The Order had the financial resources, drawn from the vast, productive estates in Europe and the lucrative banking operations that spanned the continent, to negotiate the Grand Master's release if he had only permitted it, but it was absolutely, unequivocally forbidden by the sacred, inviolable rule that Odo himself was now sealing with his own blood to offer a single bezant, a single dinar, a single concession to the infidel in exchange for the life of a professed knight, and this agonizing, irresolvable contradiction created a profound crisis of conscience within the chapter houses of the Order, a crisis that was whispered about in the dormitories and debated in the refectories but never openly discussed in the presence of the senior officers, as younger, more pragmatic brothers, men who had not been forged in the same white-hot crucible of fanaticism as their Grand Master, began to quietly, hesitantly, and with a sense of profound, almost guilty unease, question whether the rigid, uncompromising application of the rule was truly serving the long-term strategic interests of the Holy Land or whether it was merely satisfying the pride and the stubbornness of a man who had placed his own spiritual purity above the survival of the kingdom. For King Baldwin IV, the loss of Odo was a personal and strategic tragedy of the highest, most devastating order, a blow that struck at the very heart of his reign and that threatened to undo all the fragile, hard-won gains that he had achieved through a decade of unimaginable suffering and unyielding, indomitable will, for despite their frequent, bitter, and often public clashes over military policy, despite the Grand Master's insufferable arrogance, and his maddening habit of treating the king's commands as mere suggestions to be ignored when they conflicted with the interests of the temple, the Leper King had always, in the deepest, most honest recesses of his strategic mind, recognized Odo de Saint-Amand as the indispensable sword-arm of the realm, the one commander whose sheer, terrifying, almost supernatural presence on a battlefield could, as it had at Montgassard, turn the tide of a hopeless engagement, and transform an imminent defeat into a miraculous, God-given victory. Baldwin, whose own body was now a mass of suppurating, stinking wounds, whose eyesight was failing, whose voice was reduced to a hoarse, agonized whisper, and whose reign was a desperate, losing race against the relentless, inexorable advance of the Mycobacterium lepri that was consuming his flesh, sent desperate, secret, and ultimately futile messages to Damascus, not with offers of ransom, which he knew, with a cold, sinking certainty, would be rejected as contemptuously as all the others, but with heartfelt, personal pleas that Odo might at least, for the sake of his own soul and the kingdom that still needed his counsel, accept the ministrations of a Christian physician to tend his wounds or a confessor to grant him the spiritual comfort of absolution and the last rites, small, humane mercies that the Grand Master, in his unyielding, terrifying devotion to his personal Via Dolorosa, his chosen path of suffering, is reported to have courteously, gently, and with a kind of serene, otherworldly gratitude, but absolutely and irrevocably declined. The king, in the long, sleepless, pain-filled nights that were now the only reality of his existence, must have reflected, with a clarity that was sharpened by the proximity of his own death, on the bitter, tragic, and inescapable irony that the very fanaticism, the absolute, uncompromising, transcendent devotion to the rule and to the ideal of martyrdom, which made the Templars the most formidable and the most feared warriors in all of Christendom, was the same fanaticism that was now, in the hour of the kingdom's greatest peril, leaving them without their leader, without their guiding spirit, and without the strategic genius that had, on so many occasions, saved the kingdom from destruction, a fatal, irreparable flaw in the diamond-hard perfection of the Order's ideology, a crack in the armor of their faith through which the coming storm of Saladin's jihad, gathering its terrible strength on the frontiers of the kingdom, would ultimately pour, sweeping the Templars, the Hospitallers, the barons, the bishops, the pilgrims, and the holy city itself into the oblivion of history. The specific, harrowing conditions of Odo de Saint-Amand's death, which occurred sometime in the early, cold, damp months of 1180, remained shrouded in the same impenetrable, suffocating darkness that consumed his final, solitary days, for the Muslim chroniclers, usually so meticulous, so detailed, and so clinically precise in recording the fates of their high-profile captives, drew a discreet, almost respectful veil over the exact circumstances of the Grand Master's passing, perhaps out of a quiet, unwilling admiration for a foe whose defiant, unbroken suffering had transcended the normal, accepted boundaries of enmity and had entered the realm of the sacred, a realm that even the most hardened and the most cynical of chroniclers hesitated to profane with the mundane details of the death of the body. What is known with absolute, unshakable certainty is that the Grand Master did not survive the brutal, unforgiving winter of his captivity in the black, frozen depths of the Damascus citadel, the lethal, synergistic combination of the severe, prolonged malnutrition that had reduced his once powerful frame to a skeletal, fleshless ruin, the septic, spreading infection from his untreated, festering maniacal wounds that had poisoned his blood and sent waves of fever racking through his emaciated body, and the pestilential, miasmic air of the dungeon, thick with the spores of the fungi that grew on the damp walls and with the invisible, deadly vapors that the medieval physicians called the corruption of the air, finally, mercifully accomplished what the swords, the arrows, the lances, and the scimitars of 1,000 Saracen warriors had failed, over decades of relentless warfare, to achieve: the extinguishing of the fierce, proud, indomitable life that had blazed so brightly, so terrifyingly, and so gloriously on the battlefields of the Holy Land. His body, the mortal remains of the man who had commanded armies, who had shaped the destinies of kingdoms, who had defied the Sultan of Egypt and Syria to his face, and who had chosen, with a calm, deliberate, and utterly terrifying clarity, the slow, agonizing death of the dungeon over the negotiated freedom that was his for the asking, was stripped of the soiled, torn, blood-stained white mantle that was his only claimed glory, his only earthly possession, his only visible link to the order that he had served with every fiber of his being and for which he had now given his life, and was likely disposed of in an unmarked, anonymous pit alongside the other dead prisoners, the forgotten, the nameless, the discarded, a final, profound, and in its own terrible way, fittingly Christ-like insult to a man who had once been one of the most powerful and most feared individuals in the entire medieval world. Yet a fate that he had willingly, knowingly, and joyfully embraced as the ultimate imitation of his Savior, the King who had also died a naked, humiliated, abandoned prisoner at the hands of his enemies, forsaken by the world and mocked by the crowds, but who, in the eyes of the faithful, was seated in eternal glory at the right hand of the Father, and into whose company the Grand Master, his long ordeal finally ended, his sacrifice finally complete, was now, according to the unshakable conviction of every brother who wore the white mantle, eternally and triumphantly welcomed. The reaction of the Templar Order to the devastating, long-dreaded news of their Grand Master's death was not, as one might expect from a brotherhood of men who had lost their beloved leader, an eruption of grief, of mourning, of the bitter, helpless tears that accompanied the sudden, violent severing of the bonds of comradeship and shared purpose. It was, instead, a cold, grim, almost exultant celebration of martyrdom. A formal, solemn, and deeply triumphant recognition that Odo de Saint Amand had achieved, through his prolonged, voluntary, and utterly unbreakable suffering, the highest, most coveted honor to which any Templar, from the humblest novice to the Grand Master himself, could ever aspire, a death that bore perfect, unblemished, and eternal witness to the uncompromising, terrifying, and transcendent truth of the rule, a death that had refused, with a serene, implacable finality, to place the fleeting comfort of the mortal body above the eternal sanctity of the sacred vow. And a death that had, in its stark, brutal, and magnificent purity, washed away the tactical shame and the military humiliation of the disaster at Marjayan, replacing the memory of the shattered charge and the captured Grand Master with the pure, imperishable, and ever-shining gold of legend, a legend that would be told and retold as long as the temple stood, and even beyond its fall, as a testament to the terrifying, sublime, and ultimately self-destructive power of absolute, uncompromising faith. In the chapter houses across the length and breadth of Christendom, from the great, bustling commandery in the heart of London to the sun-baked, remote fortress of Monzon in the rugged mountains of Aragon, requiem masses were sung not in the somber, mournful tones of sorrow and loss but in the joyful, triumphant key of exultation and victory, the chaplains of the order. Men who had dedicated their lives to the service of the warrior monks and who understood, better than any outsider ever could, the profound, mystical theology of martyrdom that was the beating heart of the temple's identity, preaching powerful, impassioned sermons that held up the late Grand Master as a new Maccabee, a new saint of the military order, a man whose refusal to be ransomed, whose embrace of the dungeon, and whose solitary, agonizing death in the darkness of Damascus had redeemed the sins of the entire order and had purchased, with his blood and his suffering, a fresh, abundant outpouring of divine favor upon the arms and the mission of the faithful. The story of his belt and his dagger, meticulously recorded by the chroniclers, amplified by the wandering troubadours who carried the tales of the Crusades to the courts of Europe, and enshrined in the official memory of the temple, became a foundational myth, a sacred narrative, a teaching tool of immense power that was used to educate the novices, to define for them the absolute, non-negotiable horizon of their commitment, a standard so impossibly, terrifyingly high that it would inspire generations of young knights to seek death rather than dishonor, to embrace the dungeon rather than the ransom, and to follow their Grand Master, with a fierce and joyful devotion, into the darkness that was, in the theology of the temple, merely the threshold of the eternal, unending light. The strategic vacuum left by Odo's prolonged and ultimately permanent absence had immediate, destabilizing, and deeply consequential effects on the internal politics of the Templar Order, as the election of his successor, Arnold of Torroja, a Catalan nobleman of considerable diplomatic skill, administrative competence, and a far more cautious, conciliatory temperament than his fire-breathing predecessor, marked a temporary, pragmatic, and in retrospect, fleeting shift toward diplomacy, moderation, and the patient, defensive consolidation of the Order's resources, a tacit, unspoken admission by the senior brothers that the fanatical, unrestrained aggression of the late Grand Master had come at an unacceptably high military and political cost, a cost that the Order, in its current, strained circumstances, could no longer afford to pay. But this moderation, this brief, cautious pendulum swing away from the precipice of suicidal fanaticism, would prove to be nothing more than a temporary, fragile interlude, a pause for breath before the final, catastrophic plunge, for the forces of aggression, of pride, and of the unquenchable thirst for martyrdom that Odo had so powerfully embodied were too deeply embedded in the institutional DNA of the Temple to be permanently suppressed by the gentle, diplomatic hand of a moderate master. And when Arnold of Toronja died, far from the Holy Land, on a diplomatic mission to the courts of Europe, the ferocious, ambitious, and deeply embittered Gerard of Rydfort seized control of the Order and drove it, with a reckless, fanatical, and utterly suicidal energy that made even Odo seem cautious by comparison, back toward the precipice, back toward the final, annihilating charge that would shatter the Templar army and the kingdom of Jerusalem on the waterless, sun-scorched plateau of the Horns of Hattin. The legacy of Odo de Saint-Amand, however, the true, enduring impact of his life and his death on the history of the Temple and of the Crusader enterprise was not to be found in the cautious, temporary policies of his immediate, moderate successors but in the deeper, darker, more powerful currents of Templar psychology and institutional identity that he had so perfectly, so terrifyingly embodied during his long and tumultuous tenure as Grand Master, the unshakable, absolute conviction that the Order was not merely a military institution, not merely a collection of skilled soldiers bound together by feudal obligation and the prospect of plunder, but a vessel of divine will, a sacred instrument chosen by God Himself to be the sword of the Church and the shield of the Holy Land, that its knights were not soldiers but living sacrifices, their bodies consecrated to the service of the cross, their blood a libation to be poured out on the thirsty soil of Palestine, and that any compromise, any deviation, any concession to the pragmatic, material realities of the world, whether in the form of diplomacy, of truce, of tactical retreat, or of the payment of a ransom, was not merely a strategic error but a spiritual stain, a sin against the Holy Spirit, a betrayal of the sacred trust that had been placed in their hands, a sin that would be punished not by military defeat, which was temporary and could be avenged, but by the eternal, irrevocable loss of immortal souls, a punishment far more terrible than any death on the battlefield. This ideology, this terrifying, sublime, and ultimately self-destructive creed, which Odo had sealed with his own slow, agonizing death in the darkness of the Damascus dungeon, became the intangible, impenetrable armor of the Temple, the source of its legendary, almost supernatural battlefield courage, its chilling, unnerving reputation among the Muslim enemy, who learned, through bitter and repeated experience, to expect no surrender, no retreat, and no quarter from the white-mantled knights, who fought as if they were already dead, who seemed to welcome the kiss of the scimitar as a lover welcomes the embrace of the beloved, and whose only response to the offer of a negotiated ransom was the stark, unanswerable declaration that a Templar's only currency in captivity was his belt and his dagger. The Muslim soldiers, who had their own powerful and deeply ingrained tradition of martyrdom in the jihad, who understood the psychology of the warrior who seeks death in the service of his faith, nonetheless found the Templar fanaticism chilling and almost incomprehensible in its intensity. For the Templar did not merely seek death, he actively, stubbornly, and with a kind of serene, terrifying joy, refused life when it was offered to him, refused the sunlight, refused the company of his brothers, refused the command of his army, and chose instead the black, silent, rat-infested solitude of the dungeon, a choice that seemed, to the Muslim observers, to belong more to the realm of madness than to the realm of piety, a madness that was, his body, the mortal remains of the man who had commanded armies, who had shaped the destinies of kingdoms, who had defied the Sultan of Egypt and Syria to his face, and who had chosen, with a calm, deliberate, and utterly terrifying clarity, the slow, agonizing death of the dungeon over the negotiated freedom that was his for the asking, was stripped of the soiled, torn, blood-stained white mantle that was his only claimed glory, his only earthly possession, his only visible link to the order that he had served with every fiber of his being and for which he had now given his life, and was likely disposed of in an unmarked, anonymous pit alongside the other dead prisoners, the forgotten, the nameless, the discarded, a final, profound, and in its own terrible way, fittingly Christ-like insult to a man who had once been one of the most powerful and most feared individuals in the entire medieval world. Yet a fate that he had willingly, knowingly, and joyfully embraced as the ultimate imitation of his Savior, the King who had also died a naked, humiliated, abandoned prisoner at the hands of his enemies, forsaken by the world and mocked by the crowds, but who, in the eyes of the faithful, was seated in eternal glory at the right hand of the Father, and into whose company the Grand Master, his long ordeal finally ended, his sacrifice finally complete, was now, according to the unshakable conviction of every brother who wore the white mantle, eternally and triumphantly welcomed. The reaction of the Templar Order to the devastating, long-dreaded news of their Grand Master's death was not, as one might expect from a brotherhood of men who had lost their beloved leader, an eruption of grief, of mourning, of the bitter, helpless tears that accompanied the sudden, violent severing of the bonds of comradeship and shared purpose. It was, instead, a cold, grim, almost exultant celebration of martyrdom. A formal, solemn, and deeply triumphant recognition that Odo de Saint Amand had achieved, through his prolonged, voluntary, and utterly unbreakable suffering, the highest, most coveted honor to which any Templar, from the humblest novice to the Grand Master himself, could ever aspire, a death that bore perfect, unblemished, and eternal witness to the uncompromising, terrifying, and transcendent truth of the rule, a death that had refused, with a serene, implacable finality, to place the fleeting comfort of the mortal body above the eternal sanctity of the sacred vow. And a death that had, in its stark, brutal, and magnificent purity, washed away the tactical shame and the military humiliation of the disaster at Marjayan, replacing the memory of the shattered charge and the captured Grand Master with the pure, imperishable, and ever-shining gold of legend, a legend that would be told and retold as long as the temple stood, and even beyond its fall, as a testament to the terrifying, sublime, and ultimately self-destructive power of absolute, uncompromising faith. In the chapter houses across the length and breadth of Christendom, from the great, bustling commandery in the heart of London to the sun-baked, remote fortress of Monzon in the rugged mountains of Aragon, requiem masses were sung not in the somber, mournful tones of sorrow and loss but in the joyful, triumphant key of exultation and victory, the chaplains of the order. Men who had dedicated their lives to the service of the warrior monks and who understood, better than any outsider ever could, the profound, mystical theology of martyrdom that was the beating heart of the temple's identity, preaching powerful, impassioned sermons that held up the late Grand Master as a new Maccabee, a new saint of the military order, a man whose refusal to be ransomed, whose embrace of the dungeon, and whose solitary, agonizing death in the darkness of Damascus had redeemed the sins of the entire order and had purchased, with his blood and his suffering, a fresh, abundant outpouring of divine favor upon the arms and the mission of the faithful. The story of his belt and his dagger, meticulously recorded by the chroniclers, amplified by the wandering troubadours who carried the tales of the Crusades to the courts of Europe, and enshrined in the official memory of the temple, became a foundational myth, a sacred narrative, a teaching tool of immense power that was used to educate the novices, to define for them the absolute, non-negotiable horizon of their commitment, a standard so impossibly, terrifyingly high that it would inspire generations of young knights to seek death rather than dishonor, to embrace the dungeon rather than the ransom, and to follow their Grand Master, with a fierce and joyful devotion, into the darkness that was, in the theology of the temple, merely the threshold of the eternal, unending light. The strategic vacuum left by Odo's prolonged and ultimately permanent absence had immediate, destabilizing, and deeply consequential effects on the internal politics of the Templar Order, as the election of his successor, Arnold of Torroja, a Catalan nobleman of considerable diplomatic skill, administrative competence, and a far more cautious, conciliatory temperament than his fire-breathing predecessor, marked a temporary, pragmatic, and in retrospect, fleeting shift toward diplomacy, moderation, and the patient, defensive consolidation of the order's resources, a tacit, unspoken admission by the senior brothers that the fanatical, unrestrained aggression of the late Grand Master had come at an unacceptably high military and political cost, a cost that the order, in its current, strained circumstances, could no longer afford to pay. But this moderation, this brief, cautious pendulum swing away from the precipice of suicidal fanaticism, would prove to be nothing more than a temporary, fragile interlude, a pause for breath before the final, catastrophic plunge, for the forces of aggression, of pride, and of the unquenchable thirst for martyrdom that Odo had so powerfully embodied were too deeply embedded in the institutional DNA of the temple to be permanently suppressed by the gentle, diplomatic hand of a moderate master. And when Arnold of Toroja died, far from the Holy Land, on a diplomatic mission to the courts of Europe, the ferocious, ambitious, and deeply embittered Gerard of Rydfort seized control of the order and drove it, with a reckless, fanatical, and utterly suicidal energy that made even Odo seem cautious by comparison, back toward the precipice, back toward the final, annihilating charge that would shatter the Templar army and the kingdom of Jerusalem on the waterless, sun-scorched plateau of the Horns of Hattin. The legacy of Odo de Saint-Amand, however, the true, enduring impact of his life and his death on the history of the Temple and of the Crusader enterprise was not to be found in the cautious, temporary policies of his immediate, moderate successors but in the deeper, darker, more powerful currents of Templar psychology and institutional identity that he had so perfectly, so terrifyingly embodied during his long and tumultuous tenure as Grand Master, the unshakable, absolute conviction that the Order was not merely a military institution, not merely a collection of skilled soldiers bound together by feudal obligation and the prospect of plunder, but a vessel of divine will, a sacred instrument chosen by God Himself to be the sword of the Church and the shield of the Holy Land, that its knights were not soldiers but living sacrifices, their bodies consecrated to the service of the cross, their blood a libation to be poured out on the thirsty soil of Palestine, and that any compromise, any deviation, any concession to the pragmatic, material realities of the world, whether in the form of diplomacy, of truce, of tactical retreat, or of the payment of a ransom, was not merely a strategic error but a spiritual stain, a sin against the Holy Spirit, a betrayal of the sacred trust that had been placed in their hands, a sin that would be punished not by military defeat, which was temporary and could be avenged, but by the eternal, irrevocable loss of immortal souls, a punishment far more terrible than any death on the battlefield. This ideology, this terrifying, sublime, and ultimately self-destructive creed, which Odo had sealed with his own slow, agonizing death in the darkness of the Damascus dungeon, became the intangible, impenetrable armor of the temple, the source of its legendary, almost supernatural battlefield courage, its chilling, unnerving reputation among the Muslim enemy, who learned, through bitter and repeated experience, to expect no surrender, no retreat, and no quarter from the white-mantled knights, who fought as if they were already dead, who seemed to welcome the kiss of the scimitar as a lover welcomes the embrace of the beloved, and whose only response to the offer of a negotiated ransom was the stark, unanswerable declaration that a Templar's only currency in captivity was his belt and his dagger. The Muslim soldiers, who had their own powerful and deeply ingrained tradition of martyrdom in the jihad, who understood the psychology of the warrior who seeks death in the service of his faith, nonetheless found the Templar fanaticism chilling and almost incomprehensible in its intensity. For the Templar did not merely seek death, he actively, stubbornly, and with a kind of serene, terrifying joy, refused life when it was offered to him, refused the sunlight, refused the company of his brothers, refused the command of his army, and chose instead the black, silent, rat-infested solitude of the dungeon, a choice that seemed, to the Muslim observers, to belong more to the realm of madness than to the realm of piety, a madness that was, in its own terrible way, the most formidable weapon that the Franks possessed. The long-term, tragic consequences of the belt and dagger doctrine, however, extended far beyond the immediate, intimidating reputation of the order, far beyond the awe and the terror that it inspired in the hearts of the enemy, embedding a fatal, irremediable rigidity into the Templar command structure that would contribute directly, inevitably, and catastrophically to the fatal decisions that led to the destruction of the Crusader army at the Battle of Hattin in 1187, where the fanatical, unyielding insistence on charging the enemy, regardless of the tactical situation, regardless of the odds, regardless of the terrain, and regardless of the agonized, desperate pleas of the more cautious secular barons, would lead the entire Frankish host, the largest army the kingdom had ever assembled, into a waterless, sun-scorched trap from which there was no escape, where the Templar Knights, their white mantles dyed crimson with their blood, would be slaughtered to the last man, where the true cross, the most sacred relic in Christendom, would be captured and paraded through the streets of Damascus, and where the kingdom that the Leper King Baldwin IV had sacrificed his body and his life to defend would be consigned, once and for all, to the dustbin of history, a final, catastrophic vindication of the dark, inexorable logic of the sacrifice that Odo de Saint-Amand had inaugurated. With his belt and his dagger, in the black, silent depths of the Damascus citadel. The legacy of Odo de Saint-Amand, however, the true, enduring impact of his life and his death on the history of the Temple and of the Crusader enterprise was not to be found in the cautious, temporary policies of his immediate, moderate successors but in the deeper, darker, more powerful currents of Templar psychology and institutional identity that he had so perfectly, so terrifyingly embodied during his long and tumultuous tenure as Grand Master, the unshakable, absolute conviction that the Order was not merely a military institution, not merely a collection of skilled soldiers bound together by feudal obligation and the prospect of plunder, but a vessel of divine will, a sacred instrument chosen by God Himself to be the sword of the Church and the shield of the Holy Land, that its knights were not soldiers but living sacrifices, their bodies consecrated to the service of the cross, their blood a libation to be poured out on the thirsty soil of Palestine, and that any compromise, any deviation, any concession to the pragmatic, material realities of the world, whether in the form of diplomacy, of truce, of tactical retreat, or of the payment of a ransom, was not merely a strategic error but a spiritual stain, a sin against the Holy Spirit, a betrayal of the sacred trust that had been placed in their hands, a sin that would be punished not by military defeat, which was temporary and could be avenged, but by the eternal, irrevocable loss of immortal souls, a punishment far more terrible than any death on the battlefield. This ideology, this terrifying, sublime, and ultimately self-destructive creed, which Odo had sealed with his own slow, agonizing death in the darkness of the Damascus dungeon, became the intangible, impenetrable armor of the temple, the source of its legendary, almost supernatural battlefield courage, its chilling, unnerving reputation among the Muslim enemy, who learned, through bitter and repeated experience, to expect no surrender, no retreat, and no quarter from the white-mantled knights, who fought as if they were already dead, who seemed to welcome the kiss of the scimitar as a lover welcomes the embrace of the beloved, and whose only response to the offer of a negotiated ransom was the stark, unanswerable declaration that a Templar's only currency in captivity was his belt and his dagger. The Muslim soldiers, who had their own powerful and deeply ingrained tradition of martyrdom in the jihad, who understood the psychology of the warrior who seeks death in the service of his faith, nonetheless found the Templar fanaticism chilling and almost incomprehensible in its intensity. For the Templar did not merely seek death, he actively, stubbornly, and with a kind of serene, terrifying joy, refused life when it was offered to him, refused the sunlight, refused the company of his brothers, refused the command of his army, and chose instead the black, silent, rat-infested solitude of the dungeon, a choice that seemed, to the Muslim observers, to belong more to the realm of madness than to the realm of piety, a madness that was, in its own terrible way, the most formidable weapon that the Franks possessed. The long-term, tragic consequences of the belt and dagger doctrine, however, extended far beyond the immediate, intimidating reputation of the Order, far beyond the awe and the terror that it inspired in the hearts of the enemy, embedding a fatal, irremediable rigidity into the Templar command structure that would contribute directly, inevitably, and catastrophically to the fatal decisions that led to the destruction of the Crusader army at the Battle of Hattin in 1187, where the fanatical, unyielding insistence on charging the enemy, regardless of the tactical situation, regardless of the odds, regardless of the terrain, and regardless of the agonized, desperate pleas of the more cautious secular barons, would lead the entire Frankish host, the largest army the kingdom had ever assembled, into a waterless, sun-scorched trap from which there was no escape, where the Templar Knights, their white mantles dyed crimson with their blood, would be slaughtered to the last man, where the true cross, the most sacred relic in Christendom, would be captured and paraded through the streets of Damascus, and where the kingdom that the Leper King Baldwin IV had sacrificed his body and his life to defend would be consigned, once and for all, to the dustbin of history, a final, catastrophic vindication of the dark, inexorable logic of the sacrifice that Odo de Saint Amand had inaugurated. With his belt and his dagger, in the black, silent depths of the Damascus citadel. To fully appreciate the magnitude, the radical nature, and the profound, unsettling implications of Odo de Saint Amand's sacrifice, one must contrast his fate, his deliberate, chosen, and meticulously embraced death, with the standard, accepted, and entirely honorable practices of the medieval ransom culture, a culture in which aristocratic captives, even those on opposing sides of the most bitter and the most ideologically charged religious wars, were routinely, indeed almost universally, treated as valuable, negotiable assets to be exchanged, with dignity and with profit, for land, for gold, for political concessions, or for the freedom of other high-ranking prisoners, their imprisonment viewed not as a death sentence but as a temporary, albeit unpleasant, inconvenience, a setback that could be rectified through the well-established, mutually beneficial mechanisms of aristocratic diplomacy and finance. The annals of the Crusades are filled, page after page, with the names of kings, of barons, of counts, and of dukes who were captured and ransomed, sometimes multiple times over the course of their long and eventful careers, their honor and their reputation remaining fully, entirely intact, for the feudal, chivalric code of the secular nobility. A code that was rooted in the pragmatic realities of a warrior aristocracy that valued its members as scarce, expensive, and irreplaceable resources, drew a clear, bright, and universally accepted line between the body, which could be lawfully, honorably redeemed with the payment of a negotiated sum of money, and the soul, which remained the inviolable property of God and could not be touched by any earthly transaction, a pragmatic, flexible, and profoundly useful theology that allowed the political and economic machinery of war to continue to function relatively smoothly, even as the battles raged and the blood flowed. The Templar rule, as interpreted with uncompromising, terrifying literalism by Odo de Saint Amand, shattered this pragmatic, comfortable, and universally accepted compromise, declaring, with a stark, chilling finality, that the body of a professed knight was no longer his own to ransom, that his life, his limbs, his liberty, and his very existence had been irrevocably, eternally consecrated to the temple at the moment of his solemn profession, and that to negotiate with the infidel, to bargain with the enemies of Christ for the return of what was essentially a piece of sacred property was to traffic in holy things, to commit the grievous sin of simony, the buying and selling of spiritual goods that had been condemned by the Church since the days of the Apostles, a corruption of the spirit so profound that no physical liberation, no return to the sunlight, no resumption of command could ever justify or expiate. This was a revolution in the ethics of warfare, a radical, terrifying elevation of the stakes that transformed every Templar engagement, every skirmish, every patrol, every ambush, from a mere contest of arms, a struggle for tactical advantage and material gain, into a cosmic, eternal drama of salvation and damnation, a drama in which every decision, every action, and every refusal was weighed not by the standards of military necessity but by the absolute, unyielding scales of divine judgment. A drama in which the Grand Master had now, with his belt and his dagger, with his dungeon and his death, played the leading role to its grim, magnificent, and terrifyingly logical conclusion. The impact of this revolutionary, terrifying ethic on the collective morale, the institutional identity, and the battlefield behavior of the Templar Order was electric, profound, and enduring, for it provided the brothers, from the rawest novice to the most seasoned veteran, with a narrative of invincible, transcendent spiritual purity that could overcome, that could absorb, and that could transform any material defeat, any tactical disaster, any military humiliation, into a glorious, necessary preface to the ultimate, long-awaited act of witness, the martyrdom that was the true, final purpose of their existence. The disaster of Mar Jayun, which had seemed, in its immediate, bloody aftermath, like a shameful, catastrophic rout, a stain on the honor of the temple that could never be washed clean, was retroactively transformed by the light of Odo's subsequent sacrifice into a necessary, divinely ordained descent into darkness, a via dolorosa that allowed the light of the temple's ideals to shine. In the blackness of the Damascus dungeon, all the brighter, all the purer, and all the more terrible in its beauty. The novices who entered the order in the decades following Odo's death were raised from their first day in the convent on the sacred, foundational story of his refusal, taught that the belt and the dagger were not merely functional items of equipment but sacramental symbols of their total, irrevocable, and terrifying commitment, and that a true Templar, a knight worthy of the white mantle, must be prepared at any moment, and without the slightest hesitation, to follow his Grand Master into the dungeon, into the darkness, into the silence, and into the grave, asking nothing of the world but the privilege of dying in perfect, unbroken obedience to the rule, a privilege that was, in the theology of the temple, the highest honor and the surest path to the paradise that awaited the martyrs of the Holy War. This cult of martyrdom, this sacred, institutionalized devotion to the ideal of the willing, joyous, and redemptive death, while immeasurably enhancing the order's fearsome mystique, attracting a constant, steady stream of fanatical, idealistic recruits from the noble houses of Europe who sought to emulate the Grand Master's sublime sacrifice, and striking a cold, supernatural terror into the hearts of the Muslim enemy. Also created a culture of fatalism, of strategic rigidity, and of a profound, almost pathological contempt for the pragmatism, the caution, and the tactical flexibility that were, in the hands of a commander like Raymond of Tripoli, the only possible path to the long-term survival of the embattled Latin kingdom. This culture, this institutionalized death wish, made strategic retreat, tactical withdrawal, and diplomatic compromise psychologically impossible, morally repugnant, and spiritually damning for the Templar leadership, who were now trapped by the very legend that gave them their power, in a prison of their own ideology, a prison from which the only escape was the glorious, suicidal charge, a prison that would, in the end, march the entire order, singing its psalms and couching its lances, with a serene, terrifying, and utterly doomed joy, into the killing fields of Hattin, fulfilling, in a final, catastrophic, and darkly magnificent act, the inexorable, bloody logic of the sacrifice that Odo de Saint-Amand had inaugurated, with his belt and his dagger, in the black, silent depths of the Damascus citadel. The memory of Odo de Saint-Amand's death, the potent, terrifying, and endlessly inspiring narrative of his refusal and his martyrdom, was carefully, deliberately, and with the full, sophisticated resources of the Order's formidable propaganda apparatus, curated by the Templar leadership in the decades following his passing, transformed from a raw, painful, and potentially embarrassing military failure into a foundational hagiography, a sacred, unassailable tale that was told and retold in every chapter house, around every campfire, and in every dormitory of the Order, a tale that served to bind the diverse, far-flung brotherhood together in a shared, unbreakable identity of unyielding, otherworldly, and utterly terrifying courage, a courage that set them apart, in their own eyes and in the eyes of the watching world, from the mercenary, pragmatic calculations of the secular lords, the cautious, diplomatic temporizing of the Hospitallers, their bitter rivals, and the ordinary, human frailty of the common soldiers who fought for pay and for plunder rather than for the eternal glory of the martyr's crown. The chroniclers of the Temple, writing in the stylized, formal, and deliberately elevated Latin of the monastic scriptoria, men who were as much propagandists as they were historians, crafted carefully worded, beautifully phrased, and emotionally devastating eulogies that emphasized not the tactical blunder of Marjayan, not the disastrous charge that had shattered the Templar squadron and delivered the Grand Master into the hands of the infidel, but the sublime, transcendent perfection of the Grand Master's final, freely chosen act of witness, his refusal to be ransomed, his embrace of the dungeon, and his slow, solitary, agonizing death in the darkness of Damascus, a death that was portrayed as a willing, conscious, and joyful participation in the Passion of Christ, a slow, grueling crucifixion in the black, rat-infested depths of the citadel that had redeemed the sins of the entire order, washed away the shame of its recent military reversals, and purchased, with the priceless, inexhaustible currency of a martyr's blood, a fresh, abundant, and eternally guaranteed outpouring of divine favor upon the arms and the mission of the faithful. These carefully constructed, deeply moving, and immensely powerful narratives, which were read aloud, in the solemn, sonorous Latin of the Church, during the silent, communal meals in the refectories of the order, served a dual, interconnected, and mutually reinforcing purpose. They consoled the grieving brothers for the devastating loss of their beloved, charismatic leader, assuring them that his death was not a senseless tragedy but a glorious, redemptive sacrifice that would echo through eternity, and they simultaneously erected an impossibly, terrifyingly high standard of conduct, a mirror of perfection that was held up before the face of every subsequent Grand Master, every commander, every knight, and every novice who would ever don the white mantle, a mirror in which each man was forced to examine his own soul and to ask himself, in the silent, honest depths of his heart, whether he possessed the same adamantine, unshakable faith, the same absolute contempt for the fleeting comforts and the temporary safety of the material world, the same serene, terrifying willingness to rot in chains, to waste away in the darkness, and to die a solitary, anonymous, and agonizing death for the sake of the rule, for the honor of the temple, and for the love of the Christ who had died, a naked, abandoned prisoner, on the cross of Calvary. This standard, this impossible, inhuman ideal, became both the temple's greatest glory and its most profound fatal curse, an inspiration that could drive men to acts of unimaginable heroism and a trap that could, and ultimately did, lure the entire order, singing its psalms and couching its lances, into the jaws of a catastrophe that no amount of courage, no amount of faith, and no amount of martyrdom could avert. The Muslim chroniclers, for their part, those meticulous, sophisticated, and often surprisingly fair-minded historians who recorded the events of Saladin's reign for the edification of future generations, recorded the death of the Grand Master with a laconic, almost clinical, and yet strangely, unnervingly respectful detachment that paradoxically underscored the immense, unsettling impact of his defiance on the collective imagination of the Muslim world, for they were accustomed to documenting the ransoming of Frankish princes, the exchange of high-born captives, and the polite, formalized negotiations that accompanied such transactions, as routine, unremarkable, and entirely expected features of the diplomatic landscape, not as occasions for profound spiritual drama or for the kind of existential, cosmic confrontation between irreconcilable worldviews that the Grand Master's death represented. Imad ad-Din al-Isfahani, the brilliant, erudite Persian secretary and biographer of Saladin, whose flowing, elegant Arabic prose chronicled the Sultan's reign with a wealth of detail and a degree of psychological insight that was rare in any medieval chronicler, noted Odo's passing with a brief, pointed, and devastatingly simple sentence. The Frankish leader, he recorded, had preferred the darkness of the grave to the dishonor of the exchange, a statement that, in its very stark, unadorned simplicity, conveyed the profound, almost anthropological bewilderment of the Muslim elite, their inability to fully comprehend the Western, Latin, Christian religious psychology that could transform a wealthy, powerful, and politically sophisticated military commander into a willing, even eager corpse. A psychology that seemed to belong more to the realm of the early Christian martyrs who had faced the Roman lions with songs of praise on their lips than to the practical, calculating, and deeply worldly knights who controlled vast estates, commanded armies, and wielded immense political influence across the length and breadth of Christendom. This mutual, profound, and ultimately unbridgeable incomprehension, the vast, silent gap between the Islamic culture of pragmatic, negotiable honor and the Templar culture of absolute, non-negotiable, and transcendent sacrifice, would continue to define the relationship between the two civilizations, ensuring that the battlefield would always be a place of mutual terror and mutual fascination. And that the prison, the dark, silent, rat-infested dungeon of the Damascus citadel, would always be a place of mutual mystery, a darkness where the chained, starving Templar, singing his psalms and refusing his ransom, represented a form of resistance, a mode of spiritual defiance, that no amount of force, no amount of torture, and no amount of patience could ever crush, because its victory lay not in survival, not in liberation, not in the resumption of command, but in the very manner, the chosen, embraced, and transfigured manner of its death. The doctrine of non-ransom that Odo de Saint-Amand so memorably, so terrifyingly, and so irrevocably enacted with his belt and his dagger did not emerge, fully formed and armored, from a vacuum, a sudden, inexplicable eruption of fanatical zeal that had no roots in the history or the theology of the order. It was, rather, the logical, inevitable, and extreme culmination of the Templar Order's unique, unprecedented, and deeply unstable synthesis of the monastic and the martial ideals, a synthesis that had been carefully, deliberately, and brilliantly constructed in the early, formative decades of the 12th century by the Order's legendary founder, the humble, visionary Champagne Knight Hugh of Paynes, and by its most eloquent and most influential champion, the charismatic, fiery Cistercian Abbot Bernard of Clairvaux, who had, in his famous treatise, in praise of the new knighthood, declared, in a phrase that would echo through the centuries and that would become the spiritual charter of the temple, that the Templar Knight, when he killed an evil man in the course of his sacred duties, was not a homicide but a malicide, not a murderer of his fellow human being but an executioner of evil itself, a righteous instrument of divine justice who remained pure of heart, unstained by the blood he shed, and pleasing in the sight of God. This radical, revolutionary, and deeply unsettling theology of sanctified, purifying violence, which absolved the warrior monk of the moral guilt that had traditionally been attached to the act of killing, required, as its necessary, logical, and inescapable complement, an equally radical, equally revolutionary, and equally unsettling theology of sanctified, redemptive suffering. For if the act of killing in God's name was a prayer, a sacred act of worship that brought the warrior closer to the divine, then the act of dying for God's name, particularly in the degrading, anonymous, and prolonged agony of a Saracen prison, must be the supreme, culminating prayer, the ultimate, most perfect oblation of the self to the divine will, a sacrifice so pure, so total, and so precious that no ransom, no matter how well intentioned, no matter how generously funded, and no matter how politically or strategically necessary, could be permitted to interrupt or to defile it. The early Templar statutes, the detailed, meticulous, and comprehensive legal and disciplinary code that was compiled in the French rule of the order, a document that governed every conceivable aspect of the brothers' lives. From the precise cut of their hair and the quality of the cloth from which their mantles were tailored to the number of horses each knight was permitted to stable, and the specific prayers that were to be recited at each canonical hour, already contained, in their stern, uncompromising provisions, the seeds, the nascent, embryonic logic, of Odo's extreme, ultimate position, stipulating, with a chilling, impersonal clarity, that a brother who fled the battlefield in the face of the enemy or who surrendered his sacred arms and his consecrated person without the most extreme and compelling cause was to be stripped of his habit, expelled from the order, and condemned to the most humiliating and degrading of public penances, eating his meals on the bare, filthy floor like a dog for a year, a penance designed to so thoroughly, so publicly, and so irreparably shame the offender that death in battle, the glorious, redemptive martyrdom that was the order's highest honor, would seem, by comparison, a merciful, eagerly sought release. Odo's profound, terrifying innovation, if such a radical and unforgiving application of the existing principles can be called an innovation, was to apply this same stark, uncompromising, and utterly unforgiving logic, with a perfect, terrifying, and inexorable consistency, to the previously ambiguous situation of the noble, high-ranking captive. The Grand Master or the senior officer who had been taken alive, refusing to allow a loophole, a special exception, a convenient dispensation through which the wealthy, the powerful, and the well-connected might escape the full, terrible, and leveling weight of the rule that they demanded, with such relentless severity, of their humbler, more vulnerable, and less privileged brethren, and by sealing this new, absolute, and terrifyingly consistent interpretation of the doctrine with his own slow, agonizing, and utterly voluntary death. He transformed what might have remained a mere legal technicality, a subject of debate in the chapter houses and the law courts, into an unbreakable, unquestionable, and eternally binding sacred tradition, a tradition that would define the temple, for good and for ill, for the remaining century of its existence. The stark, dramatic, and deeply troubling contrast between the Grand Master's rigid, unyielding, and ultimately fatal adherence to the absolute letter of the non-ransom doctrine and the pragmatic, flexible, and eminently sensible behavior of the secular Crusader nobility, who routinely arranged their own releases and the releases of their vassals and their kinsmen through the payment of vast, negotiated sums of gold and silver, through the exchange of Muslim prisoners, and through the granting of political and territorial concessions, without the slightest stain on their honor or the slightest whisper of reproach from their peers, created a deep, persistent, and ultimately irreconcilable source of friction, tension, and mutual incomprehension between the temple and the royal court, between the warrior monks and the secular barons, a friction that would contribute, significantly and perhaps decisively, to the growing political isolation of the order in the years leading up to its catastrophic downfall at the horns of Hattin. King Baldwin IV, who had his own profound, intimate, and uniquely harrowing understanding of the nature of suffering and of the mysterious, transformative power of voluntary sacrifice, could not help, as he lay in his sick room, his body a mass of suppurating wounds, his mind a whirlwind of strategic calculations, but recognize, with a cold, sinking, and politically inconvenient clarity, that the Templar fanaticism, however admirable, however sublime, and however awe-inspiring in its abstract spiritual purity, was, in the hard, unforgiving calculus of the war of survival that the kingdom was fighting, a strategic liability of the first magnitude, a self-inflicted wound that was depriving the realm, at the moment of its greatest peril, of its most experienced, its most charismatic, and its most tactically brilliant commander, a man whose presence on the battlefield was, as Montcasard had proved, worth more than an army of 10,000 ordinary soldiers. The Grand Master's death thus became a point of no return, a moment of definitive, irrevocable rupture in the already strained, fragile, and deeply compromised relationship between the crown and the temple, a moment when the divergent, incompatible paths of pragmatic, flexible statecraft and transcendent, uncompromising fanaticism, which had been forced by the exigencies of a common enemy and a shared existential threat, to march side by side for so many years, finally and irrevocably diverged, leaving the kingdom without the physical and psychological torment of Odo de Saint-Amon's final months, the slow, grinding, day by day, hour by hour extinction of the self in the lightless, vermin-infested, and soul-destroying depths of the Damascus citadel, can only be partially, imperfectly, and imaginatively reconstructed through the sparse, reluctant, and often deliberately vague testimonies of the Muslim jailers, who were not given to recording the sufferings of their infidel charges in any detail, and through the later, inevitably embellished, hagiographic accounts of the Templar chroniclers, who were determined, for the edification of the faithful and the glorification of the order, to transform the raw, brutal, and degrading reality of the Grand Master's death into a narrative of triumphant, transcendent, and redemptive martyrdom. Yet even the most cautious, the most critical, and the most historically rigorous reconstruction of his ordeal reveals a process of suffering that systematically, methodically, and utterly dismantled every human comfort, every psychological defense, and every physical support, leaving only the bare, indestructible, and terrifyingly radiant core of the man's spiritual will, a will that seemed to draw its strength, its sustenance, and its unearthly, implacable endurance not from the failing, starving, and festering body that was its temporary prison but from some deep, inexhaustible wellspring of divine grace that was entirely beyond the reach of the Sultan's torturers and that transformed the Grand Master's slow, agonizing death into the ultimate, triumphant act of his long and tumultuous career. The dungeon's architecture, a masterpiece of grim, functional, and utterly pitiless design that had been refined over centuries of practical experience in the dark arts of incarceration and psychological torture, was a calculated, deliberate, and devastatingly effective instrument of warfare against the human spirit, a series of deep, narrow, bottle-shaped pits, known throughout the Muslim world as oubliettes, or forgotten places, that were carved directly into the living, black, sweating basalt bedrock of the citadel, there only opening a small, iron-grated hole at the very apex of the ceiling, a hole that admitted no light, no fresh air, and no hope, but through which the prisoners were lowered, like sacks of discarded refuse, by a single, fraying rope, and through which the jailers, on their irregular, unpredictable, and often deliberately cruel rounds, would lower the meager, moldy rations and the single cup of brackish, foul-tasting water that were the only sustenance the captives would ever again receive from the world of the living. In this abyss, a darkness so absolute, so total, and so all-encompassing that the passage of day and night, the cycle of the sun and the moon, became indistinguishable, meaningless abstractions, the prisoner was left alone with the relentless, maddening sound of the water that dripped, with a constant, rhythmic, torturous regularity, from the unseen ceiling, the scurrying, scratching claws of the bold, black, and ever-present rats, and the distant, echoing, despairing moans of the other forgotten souls who shared his living tomb, a symphony of suffering that was designed by the cumulative, grinding pressure of its monotony and its horror, to erode the very concepts of time, of hope, and of the self, to reduce the captive to a state of infantile, incoherent, and utterly broken dependency, and to prepare him, after months or years of this relentless, soul-crushing assault, for the final, merciful release of death, which would be welcomed not as a defeat but as the long-awaited, passionately desired end of an existence that had become indistinguishable from the torments of hell. In this abyss, this antechamber of the grave, Odo de Saint Amand, who had once commanded armies and dispensed justice from the throne of Solomon's temple, who had been the confidant of kings and the terror of sultans, was reduced, by the relentless, grinding, and utterly indifferent forces of starvation, disease, and the calculated cruelty of his captors, to a state of absolute, abject, and pitiable physical degradation, his body a living map of the suffering that had been inflicted upon it, and that it had, with a serene, terrifying, and uncomplaining endurance, absorbed, the heavy, rusted iron manacles, which had never been removed not once since the day of his capture, had, in the cold, perpetually damp air of the dungeon, rusted and corroded, their jagged, oxidized edges eating deep, corrosive grooves into the flesh of his wrists and his ankles, creating chronic, foul-smelling, and suppurating ulcers that wept a continuous, yellowish, and increasingly malodorous stream of pus and blood, a stream that attracted the bold, black, and fearless rats that shared his cell, creatures that, in the absolute, unbroken darkness, had lost their fear of the living human form and that scurried, with a cold, proprietary boldness, over his emaciated, prone body, their sharp, cold claws scratching his skin, their whiskers twitching as they investigated the source of the rotting, necrotic smell, and their sharp, yellow incisors nibbling, with an experimental, tentative cruelty at his fingers and his toes as he lay too weak, too exhausted, and too indifferent to his own fate to brush them away, a living, breathing corpse being slowly, methodically, and almost ceremonially consumed by the vermin of the earth. Yet the Muslim guards, those hard, unsentimental, and professionally desensitized men who had spent their entire careers in the grim, soul-deadening profession of incarceration and who had, over the years, witnessed the mightiest emirs, the proudest princes, and the most arrogant Frankish barons reduced, by the relentless, grinding, and utterly indifferent pressure of the oubliette, to weeping, incoherent, crawling, and utterly broken wrecks who begged, with a desperate, pathetic, and undignified urgency, for the mercy of a swift, clean death, reported, with a mixture of superstitious, almost religious fear and a grudging, unwilling, and deeply reluctant respect that was entirely foreign to their harsh and cynical nature, that the Frankish priest-warrior never cried out, never begged for mercy, and never ceased his strange, rhythmic, and unsettling chanting, the ancient, melodic Latin psalms that rose at the appointed, invisible hours that only he could discern, from the impenetrable darkness of his cell, like the voice of a ghost, a disembodied spirit that had already transcended its decaying, suffering, and utterly defeated flesh, and that now communed, with a serene, joyful, and unshakable confidence, with the God for whose service it had willingly, joyfully, and without the slightest reservation given everything that the mortal world had to offer and had received, in return, the black, cold, silent, and rat-infested darkness of the Damascus dungeon as its final, most precious, and most welcome reward. The final, culminating act of Odo's earthly existence, the precise, unknowable moment when his great, indomitable heart, which had beaten with such fierce, proud, and unyielding courage through a lifetime of war, of prayer, and of suffering, finally faltered, hesitated, and then, with a soft, almost imperceptible sigh, ceased its long, exhausting labor, and his soul, according to the unshakable, absolute, and eternally comforting faith that he had so fiercely defended and that had, in the end, demanded from him this ultimate, terrible, and magnificent price, sword free, like an arrow released from a drawn bow, of its tortured, broken, and utterly spent prison of flesh to join the glorious, triumphant company of the white-robed martyrs in the paradise of the righteous, the eternal Jerusalem that was not built by human hands and that could never be defiled by the armies of the infidel, was witnessed by no human eye, occurring silently, peacefully, and in the most profound and impenetrable solitude, in the absolute, unbroken blackness of the Damascus night, a death as solitary. This has been the chronicle of the Grand Master Odo de Saint Amand and his shocking, terrifying, and eternally resonant refusal to be ransomed, the story of a warrior whose fanatical, unyielding adherence to the sacred, inviolable Templar rule transformed a disastrous, humiliating military defeat at the Battle of Marj Ayan into one of the most powerful, most chilling, and most enduring legends of the entire Crusader era, a legend that continues to haunt the imagination of every student of medieval history, every lover of tales of unbreakable honor, and every human being who has ever paused, in the quiet, honest hours of the night, to wonder what it would truly, actually cost to hold fast to a principle when the price of that fidelity is not merely the loss of liberty, not merely the prospect of pain, but the slow, agonizing, and utterly solitary extinction of the self in the absolute, impenetrable darkness of a Saracen dungeon, with no witness but God, no comfort but prayer, and no ransom but the belt and the dagger that were the only possessions the Grand Master would deign to offer to his captors and to the world that had so desperately tried to save him. We have traced, in exhaustive, unflinching, and deeply researched detail, the path of the impetuous, ill-fated charge that led to his capture, delved deep into the dark, ironclad theology of the Templar rule that prohibited his ransom, witnessed the dramatic, almost unbearably tense scene of his rejection of Saladin's generous, pragmatic, and entirely honorable offer of exchange, followed him, step by agonizing step, into the black, rat-infested, and soul-destroying depths of the Damascus dungeons, stood in awe and in terror at the grim, solitary, and utterly unbroken death that sealed his martyrdom, and explored the profound, complex, and often contradictory legacy that his sacrifice cast across the final, tragic years of the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem and across the entire subsequent history of the order he had served with such fierce, uncompromising, and, in the end, self-immolating devotion. The belt and the dagger, those simple, unadorned, and yet profoundly, eternally resonant objects that were the only ransom he would offer, the only currency he would permit to be exchanged for his life, have become, across the vast, echoing chasm of more than 8 centuries, symbols of a kind of honor, a kind of integrity, and a kind of terrifying, sublime, An almost incomprehensible commitment that is virtually unimaginable to the modern world. A willingness to die not for glory, not for strategic advantage, not for the love of a woman or the defense of a homeland, but for the pure, abstract, and terrible beauty of an oath kept, a vow that bound a man's immortal soul to a code that was stronger than the fear of death, stronger than the love of liberty, stronger than the instinct for survival itself, a code that, in the end, consumed the very order it was meant to preserve, leaving behind only the white mantles and the red crosses, blowing like the ghosts of the fallen across the blood-soaked, sun-scorched sands of the Holy Land, and the memory of the Grand Master who had chosen, with a calm, deliberate, and utterly terrifying clarity, the darkness of the dungeon over the light of the sun, the solitude of the grave over the company of his brothers, and the eternal, unending silence of martyrdom over the fleeting, temporary noise of the world that had so desperately tried to claim him for its own. If this tale of unbreakable will, of the terrifying, sublime price of absolute honor, and of the dark, enduring mystery of a faith that could transform a man into a living sacrifice and a dungeon into a cathedral has moved you, challenged you, deepened your appreciation for the complex, often brutal, and endlessly fascinating tapestry of Crusader history, and left you pondering, in the quiet, honest recesses of your own heart, the nature of sacrifice, of conviction, and of the limits of human endurance, please show your support for our ongoing mission to resurrect these forgotten, extraordinary dramas from the dust of the archives by smashing that like button, subscribing to the channel, and ringing the notification bell so that you never miss another epic, deeply researched exploration of the past from stories of our history. Your subscription and your engagement are the vital, irreplaceable fuel that powers our work, and every like, every comment, and every share of this video helps to ensure that these incredible, moving, and thought-provoking stories of human courage, human folly, and the unquenchable, mysterious power of the human spirit in its darkest and most desperate hours continue to reach a global community of passionate, curious, and discerning history lovers. Share this video with every friend, every fellow thinker, and every seeker after truth who believes that history is not merely a dry, dusty recitation of dates and deaths but a deep, resonant, and inexhaustible well of human experience from which we can draw profound, timeless lessons of leadership, of faith, of the terrifying cost of integrity, and of the strange, paradoxical, and often tragic relationship between the ideals we profess and the blood we are willing to shed to prove them true. And leave a comment telling us what you would have done in Odo de Saint Amon's chains. Would you have clung, with the same unyielding, terrifying grip, to the abstract, eternal honor of the belt and the dagger, or would you have accepted the pragmatic, human, and eminently understandable road of ransom, of negotiation, of compromise, to live and to fight another day for the kingdom and the cause that still so desperately needed your sword? I hope you enjoyed this content, and I'll see you in the next video.